Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku became a royal candidate part 2. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 3, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story 𝗵𝗃 from AO3. So let's start the video. It was around 11 when they were woken up by a worried and curious 𝗬𝗧𝗏, who had noticed none of them was at breakfast. For a few seconds, Izuku's mind was thinking with his stomach, who was protesting that he had missed breakfast. Then, the rest of his body caught up. His limbs were cramped, someone had drooled on his shoulder. His legs were prickling, he was quite sure that 𝗬𝗏𝗃 had been lying on them. Once properly waken up, Izuku saw that they were all looking disheveled. Mina's hair was a mess. 𝗬𝗏𝗃's curls weren't faring much better. Some parts had grown a little flat while others had grown in volume. Or the difference between flat and curly made it look like it had grown in volume. 𝗎𝗪𝗏𝗃 and 𝗬𝗏 didn't have to deal with curls, but both of their hair was a tangled mess. And that was just the hair. 𝗬𝗏 was shaking her arm. 𝗬𝗏𝗃 was nursing a stiff neck by the looks of it, and 𝗎𝗪𝗏𝗃 was nursing a bruise that was probably caused by Mina accidentally kicking her. Their night clothes were crumbled, but surprisingly, still in place. Izuku had seen enough leg to last him a lifetime. You have those red marks on your face, 𝗬𝗧𝗏 told 𝗎𝗪𝗏𝗃, pointing at her own cheek. Looking at 𝗎𝗪𝗏𝗃's cheek, Izuku saw red sleeping lines on her cheek. Mina yawned widely before clapping her hands together, calling for everyone's attention. Okay, this is our plan of attack. Get washed up before lunch. After lunch, we'll pick up the dresses and start preparing. Does it seriously take that long? Izuku asked, feeling a little overwhelmed by the idea he needed about 5 hours to get his hair and dress fixed. He rarely spent more than 30 minutes on his appearance, and that was while having to fix his hair and trying to button up a dress. There are 5 people here. Sorry, 𝗬𝗧𝗏, I don't mind. 𝗬𝗧𝗏 chimed. There are 5 people here and only one person who can do hair. I'll have 5 hours to do hair, which is long, yes, but if something goes wrong, I have time to fix everything. Also, the dresses might need some adjustments or if something tears, and Midoriya needs a crash course heel wearing. Thinking about it, 5 hours wasn't too bad. 1 hour per person, if it didn't take ages to pick up their dresses and get fitted. Mina had mentioned she hadn't entirely finished Izuku's dress. There were a few adjustments to be made, but according to her, they were mostly minor details. Since she was the expert, Izuku didn't question her. For minutes, they just stood there in Mina's bedroom, rubbing the sleep out of their eyes and yawning. Turned out, Mina didn't appreciate slackers. Well, stop yawning. Go get a bath, get dressed, be in time for lunch, and we'll rock the guests their socks off. Izuku wanted to point out that most of the ladies wouldn't wear socks, but he liked Mina's enthusiasm. They all could use it with the nerves fluttering in their bellies. It was the first time in his life that Izuku actually felt, well, beautiful. His curls were voluminous and shiny. They felt greasy, but Izuku had learned to trust Mina, and the dress was absolutely stunning. It was an emerald green dress, with a tight bodice that covered the entirety of his chest area, the collar rounding off around his throat, yet it didn't feel suffocating. The sleeves stopped just shy of his shoulder, aligned with his armpits, giving his arms the freedom to move around. The skirt was now the same color as the top, and with the help of the petticoat, it looked bigger. The petticoat was constructed like a skirt, but less flowy. It felt a bit funny but gave his legs more space to move. The top had been decorated with an elegant design, subtle but interesting. Izuku liked the leaves, as they reminded him a bit of home, where he was surrounded by trees and greenery. You like it? Mina asked. It's not too tight. The back was buttoned up, the buttons running along Izuku's spine but didn't look weird on the dress. The dress was a little bit tight, but he supposed that he still could eat and not feel like he was suffocating. It's fine. The dress is nice, Mina suggested. Izuku smoothed out the skirt, the fabric feeling expensive underneath his fingertips. It's beautiful. I never expected to look this pretty. You aren't giving yourself enough credit. You aren't bad looking, but this dress does your figure justice. And your smile makes your entire face lit up. A person's best accessory is their genuine smile. Bowing was a little hard in the dress, but Izuku did his damn best. Thank you for the dress, the hair, everything. Mina's eyes were shining. You're my friend, and the dress isn't even that complicated. I have seen the ladies in the workshop producing dresses I can only dream of, but sometimes a dress doesn't have to be complicated to look good. Now Shu, you were the second one because I didn't expect to take it long. Like 𝗎𝗪𝗏𝗃, you don't have a lot of hair to work with, but I have to work with Toru and 𝗬𝗏's hair. It's going to take ages. Izuku stepped into the hallway, the fabric of the skirt bunched up in his hands. He was afraid that he would either step on it or that it would get dirty. It would be a shame if the dress got dirty even before the ball had started. 𝗬𝗏𝗃 switched places with him. Izuku only caught a brief glimpse of yellow before 𝗬𝗏𝗃 had disappeared into the bathroom. 𝗬𝗏 wasn't there yet. She had promised to help 𝗬𝗧𝗏 with her hair. 𝗬𝗧𝗏 was already fully dressed and ready for the ball. Her hair had a natural way look, which looked nothing like her first attempt to get it wavy. Her fringe was braided back. The short braid was tucked away behind a few strands of her own hair. Her dress was pink like 𝗬𝗧𝗏 requested. It was a soft color, but not too light that it blended in with her pale complexion. He was pretty sure Mina had called it rose-colored. Izuku found it a bad description as roses came in all kind of colors and were usually brighter. But he was clueless about these kind of things. The dress was knee-length, with off-the-shoulder straps. The dress looked good on her. It suited her age. She wasn't showing too much skin. And the fabric clung in all the right places. He had been spent way too much time with Mina to know all these things. "You look stunning," Izuku said, meaning every word of it. 𝗬𝗧𝗏 beamed at him, her eyes bright with excitement. "You think?" Izuku nodded. "You also look good." 𝗬𝗧𝗏 looked him up and down, once, twice, 3 times total. "Really good. I like that you've gone for no sleeves." Jokingly, Izuku flexed his arms. The muscles were there, on full display. Long sleeves would have hidden it, and it was unlikely that the fabric would actually rip, but he liked it. He never wanted to become a perfect lady, someone the prince actually could marry and not be ashamed of. Izuku was too rough to be even considered, but he didn't mind. Tonight was about having fun, feel pretty, and not even bother to think about the prince and the future queen. How many people had this opportunity? Only a few. And Izuku wasn't going to let the competition ruin that. He was going to soak in this adventure like he would enjoy any other adventure, only with significantly more girls and dresses and fewer swords. "Do you dislike it?" Izuku blinked. Dislike what? Being a girl. It took him a few seconds to process the question. Did he mind being a girl? He had grown up as a guy, and he was still a guy underneath all the layers of this dress. As a guy, dressing up as the girl should have been mortifying, shameful, make him look weak, but he hadn't minded it. Well, the heels he had minded, but the rest. This competition probably was the best thing that had happened to him. He had made wonderful friends, he had seen new things, he had grown wiser, and wearing dressing wasn't the worst. The only thing he didn't like about being a girl was that he got some leering looks from the guards, and sometimes he felt out of depth. "I don't," Izuku admitted. "I mean, it's a bit weird wearing dresses, but I've met so many amazing people here, and I think I have never been this happy, and..." Izuku swallowed deeply, finding interest in the wall. "I feel pretty." "You're pretty," 𝗬𝗧𝗏 said. "And maybe you look prettier than normal, but as a person, you're beautiful." To say he felt awkward was an understatement. This felt like a love confession, or Izuku had just really low standards. Still, he didn't have romantic feelings for 𝗬𝗧𝗏, and looking at the ease she had blurted it out, it almost felt rehearsed. "You rehearsed this?" Finally, 𝗬𝗧𝗏 started to look flustered. Izuku wondered if she even realized that she said that. "A little," she admits. "I wanted to use it on Tsuyu if the moment was right." "You still can, I will just forget about it." "You can't just reuse such a line. It never happened, so yes, you can." Izuku shot her an encouraging smile. "There is someone more worthy of those words." 𝗬𝗧𝗏 smiled. "Well, I wasn't lying. You're a wonderful person. I'm happy to call you a friend. We can hear you 𝗵𝘃𝗲. Mina shouted from inside the bathroom. "Save the love confession for your actual love interest." Izuku wanted to sink straight through the floor, and 𝗬𝗧𝗏 looked like she wasn't far behind him. "I thought since we're uncomfortably close to each other anyway, and we know each other's deepest, darkest secrets, maybe we should be on first-name basis," 𝗬𝗧𝗏 asked. He liked the idea, but he knew that there was one issue. Izuku is a boy's name. 𝗬𝗧𝗏 looked disappointed. Izuku felt bad, but he didn't want to get either him or 𝗬𝗧𝗏 in trouble. The name didn't sound like Haruka or any nickname based on that, so that was a lost cause. However, there was one nickname, but he wasn't too fond of it. "A childhood friend of mine called me Deku, but I don't think it was particularly flattering." There was a determined sparkle in 𝗬𝗧𝗏's eyes that spelled trouble. Well, not trouble per se, but it meant she had made her mind up about something. "It sounds like Deku, which means you can do it. I think it's a fitting nickname." "Why so?" "Because," she jabbed a finger against Izuku's chest. "You did it. You stood up for your family. You dressed up as a girl and participated in something this grand and important. And we're all standing on the sidelines screaming you can do it. Maybe you can't win the prince's heart, but you can fight your way past everyone that has been born into money. You can be our hero by showing those rich arses that they're surpassed by a guy in a dress." Izuku felt tears building up in his eyes. That was surprisingly sweet. "Weren't you planning on stealing the prince's bride?" 𝗬𝗧𝗏, now Ochako he supposed, shook her head, her blush getting brighter. "Unless it's Tsuyu, I'm not interested. You guys are making me sick." Mina shouted, fake gagging. "I want to join the conversation too." Hagakure shouted, sounding hurt. "I'm stuck with, ouch." The two girls in the bathroom fell quiet, and Izuku decided to change subject to something more light-heartening, safer, and definitely not about crushes. Crushes were a dangerous subject to talk about. Shouto was really tempted to flee the scene. The scene was an overly crowded ballroom. with too many rich people that wanted to talk to him. He had been quite successful in dodging the guests during the days leading to this. Most of his gratitude went to Midoriya. But now they all were drawn to him, eyeing him like vultures. They all wanted to know who was going to be his future wife if he already had made a choice. He had been urged to yell at them that there would be no bride, as he really liked guys. Momo made the situation a little bit better. She had dragged him away when it had started to become too overwhelming, and now they were talking. It looked like they were flirting, but he preferred that over being questioned like he was a war prisoner. I really like girls, Momo sighed, her gaze dancing over the ballroom. So many pretty dresses. Shouto had no real opinion on the dresses. They were colorful, he was glad about that. But aside from that, most of them had escaped his mind. He didn't care much for dresses, styled hair, jewelry and high heels. He preferred leggings and fitting shirts, wild hair and dirt-smudged faces. But he supposed that he would never get to see that because that would mean he would leave this golden prison. And that would never happen. I can't believe you haven't looked at the dresses at all. I don't care much about dresses. Momo's eyes were twinkling with mischief. You haven't seen the start of the show yet. There was a star of the show. He knew technically he was the start, but that was a well-kept secret. Midoriya looks gorgeous. I think even you, who prefers men, will appreciate how she looks. He trusted Momo and knew that she knew him well, but he doubted her. He had never been attracted to Midoriya on a physical level. The freckles and curls were cute, but that was more of a preference than anything else. She had nice legs though, tanned, freckled and muscular. Nothing about her was dainty or delicate. She was rough around the edge with a sweet smile and personality. I think Mina made Midoriya's dress. I'm really curious about what that girl can do with more time. She has a good eye for it. Shouto had to admit he was curious, but he wasn't going to give Momo the satisfaction. So they chatted for a while longer, hoping that the people would leave them well alone. If he didn't have to dance, it was like a dream come true. If he only had to dance with Momo, he also would be perfectly happy. Foolishly, he had all forgotten about Momo's warning that Midoriya looked jaw-dropping. Time had crept by slowly, and he had grown exhausted. This amount of people was exhausting on him, and the only thing that made him feel somewhat sane was spending time chatting with Momo. Despite that their parents had intended them from marrying from the very beginning, he was still close to Momo. She was a good friend and a good person. Noticing something green passing in the corner of his eyes, Shouto broke eye contact with Momo and looked at the dance floor. The song had just ended, so Midoriya and her dance partner 𝗬𝗂𝗫 had stopped. She was so close to him that he could make out most of the dress and how she looked. Midoriya was wearing a dark green ball gown with a skirt that looked like it was meant for flaring out when dancing. The dress was modest enough, though the choice of no sleeves did surprise Shouto a little. Her arms were pretty muscular, which Shouto didn't mind but probably was considered unladylike. Her hair was even curlier and fuller than before, looking glossy in the light of the thousands of candles. 𝗬𝗂𝗫 was wearing a bright yellow dress. She looked more naturally pretty, with a more delicate build and longer hair. Told you, Momo was grinning brightly. She is like the northern star, shining the brightest among a crowd of stars. The music picked up, and the girls started again, swaying on the gentle beat. The thing was, the dress didn't look all that special, aside from that the cut of the top was a bit odd. The skirt and top weren't studded with crystals or any of the like. There was no jewelry. He didn't get what made her shine until 𝗬𝗂𝗫 said something, and Midoriya's entire face lit up. The pure joy on her face made the room light up. She made the dress beautiful. Well, ask her to dance, Momo urged. Maybe you won't marry her, but you have to dance with someone. Panic settled in. Dancing with Midoriya. He had planned on dancing with Momo to fulfill the expectations and make him do whatever he wanted for the rest of the contest. But if he danced with Midoriya, the rumors would fly. It would reach his father's ears that he had danced with her, which wasn't one of his father's preferred candidates. She wasn't from a rich background. She was just a simple woman with a bright personality. I'm going to find Gyro. Good luck. And Momo just straight up left, hurrying away if Shouto had just offended her. A few of the guests were already eyeing him, probably considering how to corner Shouto and beg him for answers. Dancing with Midoriya would be better, and maybe he could ask a few other girls to dance. This made the rumors not too bad, and he by now had figured who wanted to win and who didn't. He took 2 steps towards the dance floor when he almost ran into one of the guards. It took Shouto a few seconds to recognize 𝗬𝗫𝗄𝗫, who had been a peer of Tenya for as long as Shouto could remember. Some of the knights had their family living here or close by, and more often than not, the kids started their career early. Tenya and 𝗬𝗫𝗄𝗫 were examples of this. My apologies, Your Shouto. 𝗬𝗫𝗄𝗫 apologized, bowing deeply. That was a close call. It's fine, Shouto said, sneaking a quick glance at the dance floor. Midoriya and 𝗬𝗂𝗫 were still dancing together. I'm going to. Both men pointed to the dance floor, specifically 𝗬𝗂𝗫 and Midoriya. All the color drained for 𝗬𝗫𝗄𝗫's face. I'm sorry, I didn't know Toru. 𝗎𝗫𝗄 went through several emotions in a matter of seconds. 𝗬𝗪𝗄𝗃, the one in the yellow dress. Oh, 𝗎𝗫𝗄 had thought Shouto was after the girl he liked, which explained the panicked look he previously cast. I'm more interested in Lady Midoriya. Teaming up with 𝗎𝗫𝗄 made it technically easier to separate 𝗬𝗪𝗄𝗃 and Midoriya. Two girls dancing was perfectly fine, but two guys were more frowned upon. However, it would look bad if he asked Midoriya to dance and leave 𝗬𝗪𝗄𝗃 all on her own, but that's where 𝗎𝗫𝗄 came in. He supposed that it wasn't the worst, having to dance with Midoriya. What she lacked in experience, she made up with excitement, and he had to dance with someone, and seeing as Momo had ditched him, Midoriya was his go-to. If it hadn't been for the rumors, he would have asked Midoriya. The only thing he hoped for that she didn't make it romantic. He couldn't give her the crown, even if she was the person he liked the best. He wasn't ready to see her wither away in this cage called a palace. Izuku had been pulled to the dance floor the minute he had entered the ballroom, and he hadn't managed to leave it. The person who originally had dragged him to the dance floor was an excited guard with flaming red hair. He had been quite gentlemanlike, asking for her hand and gently leading her to the center. He had looked vaguely familiar, but Izuku couldn't place him. There were too many guards for him to remember everyone. The guard had introduced himself as Kirishima, a knight in training with a night off. After 2 rounds, Izuku was pulled away by Gyro, who needed someone to play stand-in so that some of the guys would stop pestering her. Kirishima had been fine with it, opting to drag Nejire onto the dance floor. Izuku spent a few more rounds dancing with different people. Some were middle-aged men, some were fellow contestants, and even Princess Fayumi indulged him for a song. She had looked fantastic, in a snow-white dress, more elegant and mature-looking than Izuku's big, princess-like dress. She passed him on to 𝗬𝗪𝗄𝗃, which he danced with for a few songs before Shouto and another guy walked up to them. Looking at 𝗬𝗪𝗄𝗃's beaming smile, he assumed that the blonde was 𝗎𝗪𝗄. She had mentioned that 𝗎𝗪𝗄 had been late because of work. Shouto looked good. His hair was pulled back in what looked like a ponytail. The white and red were still neatly parted, but there was some messiness to it. His cheeks were rosy, and with his hair pulled back, the red mark around his left eye was more clear. Clothing-wise, he wore nothing out of the ordinary. A white tailcoat with blue accents, the colors of the royal family, white pants and shiny boots. Izuku felt a bit overdressed, looking at both guys' usual clothing style. Shouto hid behind 𝗎𝗪𝗄, the latter starting the conversation. "Would you do me the honor of dancing with me, Toru?" he asked, bowing and holding out his hand. After smiling encouraging at his friend, 𝗬𝗪𝗄𝗃 let go of his hand and took 𝗎𝗪𝗄's, smiling bashfully. 𝗎𝗪𝗄 was also red-cheeked, sweat beading on his forehead. They looked adorable together. "Would you mind?" Shouto asked, holding out his own hand. "To dance with me?" Izuku vaguely remembered Shouto talking with Momo, seeing them smile and be casual around each other, so the request seemed silly. If Shouto had to do a mandatory dance, it would be with Momo, right? So he wondered why Shouto had asked him. Sure." Izuku swallowed his doubts and took Shouto's hands. "I can't guarantee that I won't step on your toes, though." Tadaku ballroom dancing. Shouto smiled, took his waist and started to dance around, pulling him along, guiding him slowly. It was like back in the smaller ballroom. Only Izuku didn't quite as much stumble over his own feet. Their dancing felt surprisingly natural, despite their simple movements. Shouto took the lead the whole time, pulling Izuku closer, distancing himself. Letting Izuku's waist go, Shouto spun him around. The only thing touching was their hands. The dress flared out, and Izuku hoped that it would look fine. He feared they would see the petticoat underneath. If they saw, nobody let on. Shouto just kept guiding him through the dance, their hold onto each other ever-changing. One moment it went from holding one hand to holding two. Then at some point, both hands were on Izuku's waist, and sometimes just one. A few times, they let go. Most of the time Izuku was put into a spin. It was slightly dizzying, but he enjoyed the feeling. It was so much fun to spin around, especially in a dress. When Shouto pulled him back into the dance, he knew that there was a shift in mood. They were closer now, the pace was growing faster. They were mostly circling around each other, Shouto's hand on his waist and the other in his. Izuku clung to Shouto's shoulder like a lifeline, afraid he would do something stupid, like tripping. During a dip, in which Izuku was quite sure Shouto had almost dropped him, he saw that there was a wide circle around them. There were still people dancing, but all steered clear away from them. He caught Achako's gaze, and she gave him 2 thumbs up. "Why are they looking at us?" Izuku panted, struggling to catch his breath as Shouto took him for another spin. "Us? Probably you." Izuku felt his cheeks heat up. Why would they stare at him, unless, "Am I the prince's choice?" Izuku asked. It felt even harder to speak. Shouto looked startled, face growing a bit paler than he already was. "No, you're in his stead." Shouto's face grew a little more relaxed, a little more at ease. "I make the final decision on the elimination. However, I'm free to do whatever I want and make friends with whoever I want." An awkward smile played on Shouto's lips. His 2 colored eyes were shining. Izuku had never expected Shouto to utter those words. But he did want to escape. Izuku looked around the ballroom. Most people had stopped staring, returning to their own thing. The few who were still looking didn't seem to be the lot to rat them out. For a little, it's getting warm in here. Shouto had led Izuku to a balcony that looked out over the garden and left soon after with the promise of food. Izuku was always down for food, so he didn't protest at all. The peace and quiet were nice too, and it helped his beating heart to settle a little. It was stupid, being attracted to Shouto while he made it clear that he saw Izuku as a friend. Izuku jumped when someone knocked on the French doors, almost falling sideways as he craned his neck to see who it was. Kaken was leaning against the door frame, his face hidden in the shadows. "Kaken," Izuku whispered, hoping that his childhood friend wouldn't be mean. "It's weird seeing you all dressed up," Kaken grumbled. He left the door opening, opting to lean against the balcony railing. He looked peaceful like this, face younger, eyes less angry. "It isn't like I have many choices," Kaken scoffed. "You could have gone home after the first test, and otherwise after the second one. But you stayed." "Why? I've made friends here," Izuku explained. And while that wasn't the entire truth, it was the majority of it. He never really had friends before, and he wasn't quite willing to give that up yet. "And not because you would want to kiss half-half." Izuku blinked. "Half-half? Shouto." "Oh." Izuku felt his cheeks heat up despite the cold winter air. "Really? Half-half? You've terrible taste," Kaken scoffed. "Shouto is nice, and that I like him doesn't mean I'm staying here. It means I have one more motivation to stay. But the moment all my friends are gone, I'm not sticking around for Shouto." Kaken looked impressed. "Not as besotted as I expected. I don't know about you, but I didn't plan to jump the first guy I met." "Did you?" "He jumped me." Izuku, got honest, squeaked. "He jumped you." "Not immediately, but he took the initiative." "And what did you do?" "I kissed back, of course." To his surprise, Kaken smiled a little. It seemed that his friend cared dearly about this person, which was something new. Izuku had never really seen Kaken being affectionate with anyone. "He's a bundle of affection. I think you met him." When Izuku shot him a blank stare, a little bit on purpose, Kaken growled. "That sounded more like it." "Kirishima." "Oh." Kaken straightened up, a smug smile on his face. "Well, this isn't the worst conversation we ever had. I make my leave before half-half returns and fears I'm stealing his bride." Izuku protested, but Kaken was gone before he really got the chance. Shouto's bride. Sure, he doubted that Shouto would propose to him, ever. He probably wasn't even allowed that. Shouto returned a couple of minutes later with food, completely unaware that Kaken had even visited. They had been sitting on the balcony for a while when finally the winter air was started to become chilly instead of nice. Shouto had fetched some food and a canteen of water, explaining to Izuku that most of the drinks were alcohol, and while technically Izuku was allowed to drink, he doubted that he wanted to wake up with a hangover. It was nice up here. It was a lot quieter. The sky was clear and filled with stars. However, the peacefulness made Izuku grow restless. He hadn't done a lot this day, spending most of it either asleep or standing around, waiting for his friends to get dressed and styled. Any physical labor had been postponed for the next day. That left him restless, especially as he just had an adrenaline rush. Dancing was fun, especially with Shouto. Maybe because Shouto was one of the better dancers Izuku had danced with, or maybe it was because Shouto seemed to enjoy himself. He usually was a bit emotionally withdrawn, and seeing him open up like that is nice. So Izuku gathered his courage and did the asking this time. "Do you want to dance with me again?" Shouto looked at him with surprise, blinking ever so slowly. "There is no need. Nobody is looking." Izuku sighed, a little louder than planned. "I do like dancing, actually." "Oh, I have never danced before today." "Well, ballroom dancing, and I understand you can get sick of it easily. If I had to dance with every person in the room, I would get tired too. But I like dancing with you." Shouto looked deeply uncomfortable. If he hadn't been raised alongside royalty, he at least would have scooted a bit away from Izuku. This was more romantically toned than planned. "Because you're one of the best dancers there. That isn't twice my age. I don't mind dancing with my friends, or even a few of the guards, but you know what you're doing. You're sticking around for my dancing skills." Izuku wasn't sure if Shouto was hurt or joking, but he decided to go with joking. That way, he could brush it off. He didn't want to make tonight too emotional. There was no future in him and Shouto. Not now, not ever, so he wasn't going to pursue it. "You're a good listener too." Izuku forced himself to grin. "I mean, I can still ask the princess, but I feel awkward talking to her. She is royalty." "You like the princess?" "No." Izuku cringed at how shrill his voice sounded. "No, not romantically. I barely even know her. I think she's kind, and a little bit sad." Shouto blinked as if Izuku had said something completely new. "She's sad. Wouldn't you be?" Izuku asked. He had expected that Shouto knew what he was talking about, though this was Shouto. He had made it clear he knew surprisingly little about women. "She is the first in line, technically. But her youngest brother gets the crown. It isn't even the firstborn male. No, it's the youngest male in your family that gets the crown. In a normal family, the firstborn gets it all if they want. Gender rarely matters. And if they aren't interested, the offer goes to the younger siblings or close relatives. Shouto straightened, his expression blank. Clearly, this was news to him. I never knew. Izuku took Shouto's hand in his, hoping that he wasn't overstepping any boundaries. Shouto didn't flinch or scurry away, so he took that as a good sign. I don't think you've seen much from the outside world. Izuku started, trying to keep his voice even and non-judgmental. But most of the time, families can't afford the last son or firstborn son rule. Any child is valuable to most families, as they need as many hands as possible to keep their business going. Uraraka works as a craftswoman because her parents can't get hired help. 𝗳𝗪𝗃𝗃 does the heavy lifting in her parents' bakery because they can't afford help, and her father is getting old. Ashido shares a small house with her 5 siblings and parents, unable to afford anything bigger. 4 siblings are younger than her and unfit for work yet. Tsuyu, that's Asui, barely had any schooling because she had to babysit her younger siblings from a young age. All girls are the head of their family. Only Tsuyu and Mina, Asui and Ashido, having a younger brother, and most of them barely getting by. Imagine them being told that they wouldn't inherit their family business because they're a girl. Or, even better, that their baby brother has more right to own it, despite not having worked a day in their life for the business. Shouto remained silent for a long time, long enough for the cold to really settle in. The bare arms had been a nice idea at first, but it wasn't fit for the winter weather. We should get back inside. You're cold. It was a statement. It wasn't a no, you're cold. Come, you're cold. Let's go inside to warm you up. No, it was you're cold because you're shivering. Izuku didn't complain, despite wanting to. Shouto was his friend, and he shouldn't expect more from him. And he would rather die than beg for Shouto's jacket. The jacket looked pretty comfortable and warm. It would be a bit too small for Izuku though, as Shouto had a much slimmer build than he had. He allowed Shouto to haul him up, and they returned to the ballroom. It was still crowded with people, which meant their entrance went nearly unnoticed by the masses. Ochako had sniffed them out in seconds, a cheeky grin on her lips as she saw them, still holding hands. Right, he had totally forgotten about that, especially as Shouto's left hand was warm and comfortable against his frozen one. We were wondering where you were. It seems you two were on a romantic getaway, Ochako said, almost cackling. Only then Shouto noticed their hand holding, and hurriedly let go. That was one way to make it more obvious. We just got some fresh air, Izuku said, trying to muster a glare. He was doing a poor job, judging by the fact that Ochako was looking even more amused. This room is suffocating. No smooching. No smooching. Ochako sighed. Well, since you're here, let's dance. Mina has stolen Tsuyu from me, so I have been without a partner ever since you disappeared. Taking Ochako's outstretched hand, he awkwardly waved Shouto goodbye. Shouto's cheeks were apple red. His eyes were wide with was either shock or surprise. He was even slightly gaping, which was hilarious for a guy that had grown up in a palace. Great riches didn't faze him, but good-hearted fun-making was clearly something he wasn't used to. So, you really didn't do anything. Izuku shook his head. I don't want to pursue Shouto like this. Well, he doesn't dislike you. He snorted loudly. Heat radiated from his cheeks, and he felt warmth creepy up his neck. What kind of sound was that? Ochako continued. I don't know if Shouto likes guys, but I think he would head over heels fall in love with you if he did. Izuku shook his head in disbelief. Why would he? You're lovable. Not necessarily bad looking, and right now, he can't stop looking at you. While he didn't believe Ochako, Izuku looked over his shoulder. He caught Shouto's gaze, who hurriedly looked away. Oh, that sucked. Shouto might be actually interested in him. As a girl, it sounded like a good plan to forego any plans of romance until, well, forever. It was 2 days after the winter ball that a notice was placed on the dining hall door. The note was bright and clear. 6 girls would leave the next morning. The winter ball had been a test after all. Tears sprung in Izuku's eyes, his breath catching in his throat as he read the notice. Mina and 𝗳𝗪𝗃𝗃 would be leaving the competition. He would lose 2 of his friends. Their hallway suddenly empty, with just him and Ochako. Though, looking over the other names, he wasn't as unfortunate as Gyro. The last person in her group had been eliminated, leaving her all on her own. Tsuyu was in the same boat as Izuku, with having Nejire as the only left of her group. Now there were just 8 girls left, competing to become queen. That was a third of the original amount of contestants. Hey, don't cry, it was bound to happen. Mina placed a hand on his shoulder in an attempt to comfort him. Now the waterfalls truly started. With a sob, Izuku turned around and hugged Mina tightly, hoping to muffle his sobs. He knew he was ridiculous. He only knew them for 3 weeks, and here he was, sobbing in Mina's chest as if they had known each other for ages and he would never see Mina again. Shouto. Midoriya's words were still plaguing him, which Shouto hadn't expected at all. He had grown used to shrug everything off whenever they were complimenting him or tried to belittle him. Words were just words, but Midoriya's words were still lingering in his head, playing on repeat. 𝗵𝗲𝗵𝗲 would be the rightful heir to the throne in any normal scenario. Yet, here he was, picking the future queen while his sister was just considered a princess. Eventually, she would be married off to a rich family with a male heir. Actually, thinking about it, Shouto was surprised she hadn't been married off yet. His other siblings, 𝗬𝗎𝗄, had left the palace the moment he turned 18. He hadn't disowned their family, just decided to take a job elsewhere. He currently was working with the royal fleet. 𝗬𝗎𝗄 never had been interested in seafaring, but it was the only way for him to leave the palace behind with their father's permission. Since the contest was currently on a standstill, the 6 eliminated contestants would leave tomorrow. Shouto had all the free time he desired. His father had decided that, as the competition was starting to get to a close, Shouto wouldn't need to do his duties. That meant he had a lot of free time to spend in the library in the privacy of his personal room to study. He didn't like studying, but he knew he had to do something. So here he was, reading the NTH book about his family's history. He was trudging through the previously mentioned books when the door swung open. Shouto jumped, needing a few seconds to realize that it was Tenya standing in the door opening and not anyone from his family. His friend eyed the stack of books with curiosity but thankfully didn't comment on it. "I've some news," Tenya told him, closing the door. They rarely closed the door, as it was a safety hazard and they needed some fresh air. When they closed the door, they did it because something important was going to be discussed. Something bad. Tenya looked hesitant, but no pained. "I'm not sure. It's not terrible, but it can change the entire game." Shouto sat up a little bit straighter, wondering what Tenya had found out. Did his father know about his preference for men? He was quite sure that he had kept it under tight wraps. On the other hand, it wouldn't change anything. His father would still force him to marry a woman and carry on the line since he was next in line and all. "I was looking through the papers I collected from the contestants. The last ones arrived yesterday." He vaguely remembered that Tenya had requested information about all the contestants. Of course, they had done a basic screening for safety reasons, but that's it. Whatever was going on in their lives was up to them to share, or up to their hometowns to tell. "I found papers about a marriage request," Tenya started, sitting down on Shouto's bed. Noting Tenya's voice, Shouto knew he was tactile. It was approved. Based on the dates, Midoriya Haruka is supposed to marry 𝗵𝗃𝗲𝗄 upcoming spring. What? He was quite sure his brain had just stopped working. Midoriya is going to marry someone upcoming spring. She was going to marry a woman next spring. The marrying a woman part didn't bother him, but it made him question why she was still here. She could have left after the first test if she wanted. He knew that the candidates were forced to come, and he wasn't going to break up a future marriage. If this is true, I don't get why she's still here. Or, what he was actually thinking. If it's true, why did she reach out to him? She might not like him romantically, but he didn't get why she purposely sought him out, while she had many other friends here. "I've looked into it, and I might found an answer." Tenya took out a piece of paper, crumbled and smudged with ink. Most likely, he had written some of his notes down to avoid getting the facts wrong. It had happened before, and neither wanted to have a repeat of that incident. Midoriya Haruka might not be. "Well, Midoriya Haruka," Tenya said as if it explained everything. It didn't. Shouto was confused. "Like, she is replaced by a shapeshifter?" Tenya groaned. "That was no. Midoriya Haruka has a cousin around her age." "Oh, like Lady Hato, who went in her sister's place?" To his surprise, Tenya shook his head. "Not entirely like that. Yes, Midoriya Haruka's cousin could have gone in her stead, probably has, but the issue lies in her cousin." Shouto suddenly felt ill. Was Midoriya's cousin a criminal? Her cousin's name is Midoriya Izuku. "You mean Izuki?" "No, Izuku. A boy's name. Her cousin is a guy." Now he understood what Tenya meant when he said that this could change the entire game. If Midoriya Haruka was actually Midoriya Izuku, a guy, it could change many things. Shouto could find someone he actually could love, and marry off his own free will and not continue the line. However, if Midoriya was a guy, they couldn't conceive children, and he doubted that Midoriya wanted to be stuck wearing dresses for the rest of his life. This must be a temporary solution, to make sure his cousin wasn't stuck marrying the prince and could marry her fiancé if the competition lasted longer than expected. Additionally, what would happen if his father found out that Midoriya was a guy? He would explode, no doubt about that. And Shouto would have to fess up about his interests, which wouldn't make him any happier. And even if Midoriya was a guy, would he be interested in Shouto? He might be acting the whole time, and getting close to Shouto was just a part of the act, an unnecessarily difficult part of the act. Midoriya, whoever he or she was clever. They would never do something as stupid as taking unnecessary risks. "You're taking it surprisingly well." Shouto drummed his fingers on the desk, his mind forming a plan. If Midoriya was a guy, and like him, maybe, with the proper plan in motion, with the right arguments, he would get a husband out of the situation and is happily ever after. And if that didn't work out, he might win his ticket for freedom. "I think I can make it work," Shouto said. Once I find the answers, he gestured to the pile of books. Tenya didn't look convinced but knew to leave Shouto alone when he got this crazy idea in his head. When he was 12 years old, he had been convinced that a dragon lived in their dungeons and that at night, fairies danced in their gardens. He had no proof, but that didn't mean he hadn't tried. When he grew older, he liked to research less fantastical but still intriguing things. There was Yamada's secret husband, then there was Shinso's relationship with Aizawa, and whoever the person was that Mayumi was seeing. Once Hagakure and Mina moved out, their hallway felt empty. It was just him and Ochako now, 1 bathroom and 4 empty rooms. Nejire, however, came up with the brilliant idea to relocate. She still had Tsuyu, but Jiraiya was all on her own now after Tsunotori left. Momo, Kendo, and Intelli were still with 3, so they were fine. It wasn't as empty as is in Ochako's hallway was the closest to the central area of the palace. The other 3 girls would move there, filling up the void Hagakure and Mana's departure left behind. All the rooms had been stripped bare, ready for their new owners. Izuku was helping out Jiraiya, who used him as a walking clothing rack. Dresses upon dresses were piled in his arms. He hadn't realized how many dresses Jiraiya had until he could no longer see over the pile, having to look past it. Maybe they shouldn't have gone for the divide and conquer and just go from room to room. Do you have your hands free? Jiraiya asked, hiking her bag on her back and carrying another bag in her free hand. A few instrument cases were still propped against the walls, but were too big or heavy to be moved with just 1 hand or less. Izuku wiggled his fingers, managing to move around his hand a little without dropping the dresses. That's a yes, good. Jiraiya picked up a violin case. Now she was entirely relying on Izuku to open doors, if necessary. Divide and conquer was really a bad strategy in this case. Leaving the almost empty shell of a room, Izuku tracked through the palace corridors with the help of Jiraiya. He didn't know these hallways all that well, generally avoiding the sleeping quarters during exploration. The sleeping quarters were private, after all. They ran into Shouto, who needed a double take to take in what he saw. Am I missing something? He asked, scratching his head. We're moving, Izuku answered. Personally, he would have stuffed it into a suitcase. But he knew how wrinkly dresses could get, and he didn't want burden the staff with more work because he was too lazy to carry a dozen dresses. Moving. I will explain later, Izuku promised, feeling the bulk of the clothes throwing him off balance. He offered Shouto a quick smile and hurried along. He could hear Jiraiya snigger, not even trying to be quiet. Once they were out of earshot, Jiraiya took the opportunity to tease him. So, you and Shouto, we're just friends. Very good friends, Jiraiya teased. I mean, he doesn't talk with anyone but you. And don't think it went unnoticed that you 2 left during the ball. Izuku was pleasantly surprised that he managed to right himself when he stumbled. This was one of those moments he typically would slam against the floor and bruise or break something. Luck has been on his side for once. Did many people notice? He never had been happier to hear no. It's just the contestants who noticed. It's not hard to see that the 2 of you are close. Izuku was glad that they finally arrived at Hagakure's old room. Now he could just immerse himself in helping Jiraiya unpack, hang clothes, put away the items on the higher shelves without having to throw them. It was quiet in their hallway, so he figured that the others hadn't returned yet. Opening the door, Izuku dropped the clothes on the freshly made bed. Shouto and I aren't that close, I think. Izuku hesitated, wondering if he should tell Jiraiya. Since they were going to be living close to each other, it seemed fair. And Jiraiya was a good person. And if we're, nothing will come out of it. I don't think he would want to court me if he actually knew me. Jiraiya snorted. That's a terrible excuse. What about you, doesn't he know? You don't shave your legs. Well, I don't shave my legs, but that isn't the issue. He took a deep breath, readying himself. I'm a guy. Jiraiya looked a little surprised, but the surprise only lasted seconds before she started to laugh. A guy. That's the issue. Shouto doesn't know. And imagine crushing on someone and then finding out they're the wrong gender. Then you tell him. Izuku stared at Jiraiya with disbelief. He was supposed to tell Shouto he was a guy. That wouldn't go down well. He already imagined himself saying something along the lines of, Hey Shouto, I know you've known me as a girl for over 3 weeks, but I'm actually a guy dressed as a girl and I also like you. But I doubt you like guys, so that's awkward. Yeah, that sounded like a plan. I could be arrested. Fair enough. Jiraiya pondered a while longer. Then I'm out of ideas. Maybe dress like a guy and try to seduce him. He doesn't have to know that you're one and the same person. You probably look a lot different as a guy. He wanted to say no, that he didn't look all that different as a guy, but he doubted that Jiraiya would believe him. He made a semi-convincing girl. For all she knew, he tried his damn best to look like a girl. I don't look that different as a guy, Izuku said. Before they could go into details, the others arrived. While he didn't see them arrive, they were loud enough to announce their presence. Leaving the room, he saw Ochako trying to open one of the bedroom doors, but like the rest, her arms were piled with clothes. If it had been a music instrument, like Jiraiya had been carrying, it was easier to lay that on the ground. but nobody in their right mind would drop clean clothes on the ground. Wait, let me. Izuku pushed open the door, making space for 𝗬𝗧𝗄𝗃 to stagger into the empty room and drop the clothes on the bed. 𝗬𝗧𝗄𝗃 followed, which left Tsuyu with him and 𝗎𝗫. He opened one of the bedroom doors and took about half of Tsuyu's wardrobe out of her arms. Sometimes, Izuku felt small, especially compared to other men. But Tsuyu was easily a head shorter than he and struggled with carrying the heavy, big dresses. The people who thought that dresses were light and airy never had to carry one or wear one. They regrouped in the hallway after they dumped the clothes on the bed and put luggage out of the way. 𝗎𝗫 was eyeing him with curiosity but thankfully didn't push. However, her curiosity didn't go unnoticed, especially with 𝗬𝗧𝗄𝗃, who was naturally curious. So, who knows? She asked, almost crowding in his space. Know what? He wasn't sure what she was asking. Did she know about the gender thing? If so, how? You know, the thing. Very descriptive. Well, if he kept it vague enough, he wouldn't risk much. And it wouldn't be the worst if 𝗬𝗧𝗄𝗃 found it. She was known for being both really curious and really perceptive. There was little you could from her. Everyone here. Finally, 𝗬𝗧𝗄𝗃 took a few steps back, allowing Izuku to properly breathe. You do make a really convincing girl, 𝗬𝗧𝗄𝗃 said cheerfully. Izuku just stared at 𝗬𝗧𝗄𝗃 in surprise. He was quite sure that he had been convincing enough, especially for the people with who he didn't spend a lot of time with. Yes, 𝗬𝗃 had admitted she had suspected it, and while not admitting it, he was quite sure that the other of his close friends had been suspecting something. 𝗬𝗧𝗄𝗃 laughed, her cheeks growing a pale red. I mean, it was the little things. I wouldn't have noticed if I didn't grow up with two guys as my good friends. You remind me a lot of one of them. And then the idea just formed. Well, since everyone knows, 𝗎𝗫 piped in. I still wonder how you look like a guy. Now I wonder too, 𝗬𝗧𝗄𝗃 admitted, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Though I don't think that different. It isn't a wig, is it? Izuku shook his head. Now all four girls looked at him with curiosity. And he knew that he only would get some quiet and peace if he would just show them. He was quite sure that he had brought some men clothes along. If I show you, will you drop it? 𝗬𝗧𝗄𝗃 nodded with excitement. 𝗎𝗫 was quieter in her excitement, but she nodded. He changed, the men's clothing feeling slightly off. The clothes felt a little too big, and the clothes clung to him in the wrong places. It probably was because he was so used to wearing dresses that a simple shirt and pants were weird. The girls' reactions were like he expected. A few titled heads, brows furrowed in surprise. You don't look all that different, 𝗎𝗫 admitted. It's weird that you both make a convincing girl and guy. Izuku shrugged. I blame it on my cute face. 𝗬𝗧𝗄𝗃 nodded in agreement. You do have a youthful face. You're also here in someone else's stead. Izuku nodded, tugging on the hem of his shirt. He didn't realize he had lost any mass at all, but clearly he had lost some of his muscle mass. He shouldn't be surprised since he didn't do a lot of physical labor. I'm here instead of my cousin. She's getting married this spring, and since we do look alike, I decided to go in her stead. But why stay? Why stay? It was a combination of things. The adventure on its own, the friends he made, and Shouto. He had to admit that Shouto played some role in this, even if they would never work out. Izuku would finally experience romance for the first time. Young love, 𝗬𝗧𝗄𝗃 sighed wistfully. Now I regret relocating here, 𝗎𝗫 said. Anyone willing to help me carry the rest of my instruments? Before Izuku could say yes, 𝗬𝗧𝗄𝗃 and 𝗬𝗃 volunteered. Maybe it was for the best since Izuku still had to change his clothes and he had seen 𝗎𝗃's instrument collection. If the girl didn't need an entire ship, she might have carried a piano along. I will help you put your clothes away. Izuku offered Tsuyu as the rest of the girls disappeared. Tsuyu smiled at him with gratefulness, though he didn't quite understand why. He supposed that none of them was actually used to this. Actually, thinking back on what everyone had told him, most of them lived busy lives, with little for their social lives. Izuku had rotten luck. He didn't even lose rock, paper, scissors. No, 𝗬𝗃 and Tsuyu had outsmarted him. Izuku probably knew the palace the best of them all, and he had a hard time saying no to his friends. So he had been stuck with the task to hunt down the knight called 𝗎𝗫𝗄𝗃. 𝗎𝗫𝗄𝗃 had been 𝗎𝗫𝗄𝗃's date for the winter ball. However, 𝗎𝗫𝗄𝗃 hadn't been able to say goodbye as he had been stationed in the city to make sure that the further festivities went well. By the time he returned, 𝗎𝗫𝗄𝗃 had left. She had given 𝗬𝗃 a letter with the request that they would give it to 𝗎𝗫𝗄𝗃. They had turned into Izuku because he was just too damn weak, clutching the letter tightly. He wished that dresses had pockets. Izuku walked around the palace, hoping to find 𝗎𝗃𝗃. A few of the guards had picked up on his searching behavior and had asked him if he was looking for something. Izuku had explained he was looking for 𝗎𝗃𝗃. Most of them were clueless, but one night, a blonde and overly energized one had told him that 𝗎𝗃𝗃 was usually stationed near the gate, as he oozed gentleness and was much better at welcoming guests than some grumpy asses. Izuku heard him whisper 𝗵𝗃𝗃 under his breath and realized that the guard must have been talking about Kaken. The guard wasn't wrong. Kaken wasn't a people's person. Izuku followed the knight's directions and managed to find 𝗎𝗪 milling around in the large garden located at the gate of the palace, looking bored and sad. The few times he had seen the guy, he had looked quite chipper, but that might have been because 𝗬𝗪𝗧𝗧 had been there. Walking up to the knight, the man seemed surprised to see Izuku there. "Lady Midoriya, right?" 𝗎𝗪 asked. Izuku nodded. 𝗎𝗪, the knight nodded. "Do you like 𝗬𝗪𝗧𝗧?" Izuku asked, recalling his friend's instructions. She had been blushing when she had been reciting them, but he understood where she was coming from. Long-distance relationships were hard enough to begin with, and having an uninterested party member wouldn't make it any easier. 𝗎𝗪𝗧's cheeks grew apple red. He looked like a blushing teenager who was being confronted with his first crush. Maybe it was his first crush. 𝗎𝗪𝗧 didn't look much older than Izuku was or the other girls that had attended the contest. Yes, I mean, she is sweet and excitable and really pretty. I think the prince would have been crazy to send her home, if not for the fact that he clearly has set his eyes on another girl. Izuku almost trusted the letter towards 𝗎𝗪𝗧, ready for it to be over, before realizing what 𝗎𝗪𝗧 had said. Did he just say that the prince has set his eyes on another girl? The prince had already chosen a girl. But how did 𝗎𝗪𝗧 know that? The prince has been gone for weeks. He hadn't shown his face once. You know the prince. 𝗎𝗪𝗧 grew pale, his warm flush gone in seconds. Well, yes, not on a personal level, of course. Some confidence returned to 𝗎𝗪𝗧's face. There is palace gossip. And Shouto has been exchanging letters back and forth, so there is some information. Of course, Shouto had to contact the prince in one way or another. He didn't make all the decisions, after all. So the prince must at least be aware who the candidates were, who were sent home and who Shouto deemed the best fit for him. Is that letter for me? Izuku didn't even realize 𝗎𝗪𝗧 had changed the subject, as his mind still trying to figure out how he could approach Shouto and ask. He didn't care much who the prince would marry, but he was curious. Mina must have rubbed off on him, and he had his friend's interest in mind. Ochako would be crushed if she had to marry the prince. Actually, most of them would be crushed to marry the prince. They didn't know him at all. Marrying someone against your will was one thing, but marrying a complete stranger was even worse, especially as no one had signed up for this. He handed the letter to 𝗎𝗪𝗧, who opened it and started to read it, because he had been so distracted. Izuku almost missed the cute smile, the twinkling in 𝗎𝗪𝗧's eyes, and the way that he held the letter close to his chest. 𝗬𝗪𝗧𝗧 must have written something ridiculously sweet. "Thanks for the letter," 𝗎𝗪𝗧 said. He had carefully tucked into his uniform, away from the prying eyes of the other knights. "I will make sure to write to her the answer." Considering that his job was done, Izuku excused himself. It was time to hunt someone else down. Shouto might not give him answers, but he could try. Maybe he could learn something about the prince. After all, maybe he was stuck here forever. This palace could become his home. That idea had seemed ridiculous when he first started the competition, but back then, there were 23 other girls. Now just 8 girls were competing for the undesired crown. Realizing that, Izuku wondered if he should consider going home sooner or later before he was stuck here forever. With their number reduced significantly and every single one of them slightly on edge, the end was nearing, and everyone what that meant, the mood was rather somber. Tsuyu had left the palace to visit the docks, saying she needed some fresh air and wanted to see something familiar. Ochako had tagged along, claiming she needed some fresh air too. Gyro had shot him an all-knowing look, and Izuku didn't bother to correct her. Something was going on between the two of them, but he decided to leave them alone. The rest had found another way to entertain themselves. Gyro was teaching Momo, Kendo and Nejire how to play poker, the cards borrowed from the guard's chill-out room. As usually, Intelli had disappeared from the face of the planet, doing her own thing. She clearly didn't want anything to do with them. Izuku had found a small, semi-indoor garden to spend his free time in. It was completely deserted, something Izuku right now preferred. The weird thing was that in the past, the knights who had been stationed at the door just had glared at him and shooed him away. But this time, he was quite sure he had seen this guard before he was granted access. Well, not after having a chat with the guy. Turned out that this guy was friends with the blonde knight Izuku had met yesterday when he had been looking for 𝗎𝗪𝗧𝗧. Apparently, Izuku was one of the few people who talked to them. The only knight that had been granted the time of day had been 𝗎𝗪𝗧𝗧, who had been talking a lot to the girl with dark skin, bright outfits, and excited smiles, which Izuku explained was 𝗬𝗪𝗧𝗧𝗧. The garden was basking in the sun. For the time of year, it was pretty warm and lively, with insect humming and birds gathering food. Clearly, they were used to human presences, as they didn't even bother to look at Izuku. He sat down on a randomly placed bench, soaking up the sunlight and, not all that surprisingly, dozing off. Hours later, he was woken up by someone shaking him gently. Yawning, feeling more tired than he had when he had sat down, Izuku made eye contact with the only other human soul in this space. The man had startling red eyes, framed by glasses. He looked vaguely familiar, and it didn't take Izuku long to figure that this was the same knight that had escorted him to Aizawa's office after the second trial. It was odd to see him for a second time. Not that he hadn't seen other knights multiple times, but he had the feeling that this guy wasn't one of those hired help. The man wore the official uniform of the royal guard, and he carried an air of importance. "Hi," Izuku yawned, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. "Why do you always catch me asleep?" The knight blinked in surprise. "You remember me? Of course, I'm not blind. And red eyes, glasses. You're hard to not to notice. I mean, imagine not noticing Shouto. The guy has long, red and white hair, and that's just the hair." He hadn't noticed how tense the knight had been until he relaxed, shoulders slumping, face relaxing in a small smile. Izuku couldn't say the man was bad looking, but that could be said about most men he had met here. There were a few who were absolutely stunning, but there were enough men that looked well put together. A knight, especially not in the service of the royal family, couldn't run around with wild hair, an unkempt beard and bad hygiene. That was a ticket to be fired. The knight remained standing around, looking uncomfortable and unsure. Clearly, he hadn't accounted for Izuku's presence. Looking around, Izuku saw a straw dummy stuck into the ground, one that wasn't there before. A sheathed sword was propped against it. "Oh, this is your training spot." The knight nodded. Izuku got up in a hurry, ignoring the ache in his back. He should have known he would doze off the moment he sat down in the sun. The faint chill in the air wasn't enough to keep him awake. "I'm sorry for intruding. I will leave. You don't have to," the knight blurted, grabbing Izuku's wrist. He let go seconds after, looking embarrassed. "Sorry, shouldn't have touched you." It was barely a touch. He had spent a lot of his childhood fighting with Kaken, and he was generally a touchy-feeling kind of person himself. Then he realized that he was a girl and that the guards explicitly had been told not to make the first move. If the girls were interested, fine, but not the other way around. "It's fine, really," Izuku assured, not wanting the man to feel bad. "You often act on instinct, which also includes this." The guard nodded, but his smile was still painful. "So you're practicing sword fight. Can I watch?" "What? Can I watch you practice training? I've always been interested myself, even tried it myself," but he couldn't use his usual excuse, which was that he couldn't leave his mother behind. Then the realization hit him. He always had made up an excuse not to go to the academy. They don't accept girls in the academy. He didn't know for sure, but considering that there are no female knights at all, he considered it likely. Some women wanted to become a knight, just like there are guys who wanted to become healers, or dressmakers, or anything considered feminine. But society wasn't quite ready for that, it seemed. The guy nodded, clearly buying Izuku's excuse. "Sure, it isn't really exciting, but if this is how you want to spend your free time." The knight reached for his sword, nearly dropped it when Izuku blurted out his next question. "What's your name?" "Ida Tenya," the guy answered. "You are Lady Midoriya, right?" Izuku nodded, a little surprised that the knight knew his name. On the other hand, the group had shrunk significantly, and according to Mina, something she said before she had left, Izuku was a popular subject when it came to palace gossip. How he had run off with Shouto during the ball, probably to make out like teenagers. There had been no lip-locking or even romantic gestures, but his name was on many of the people their mind. Midoriya Izuku, the girl that liked the prince's good friend. That would go down well. Watching Ida train was fascinating. He had been right that it wasn't all that exciting, but Ida was a trained knight. He had the right technique. It made Izuku itch to finally bring his notebook back to light and start taking notes. Maybe he could do that next time if there was a next time. Tenya was most likely indulging him and hoping that Izuku would never return. He knew that something was going to happen. After all, 𝗬𝗲𝗄 only showed up when something was going to happen. Not that you couldn't randomly meet her in the palace, but when she showed up at breakfast, lunch, or dinner, you knew that something was up. She looked really chipper when she walked in, holding a wrinkled piece of paper in her hand. Most likely the notes that clearly had seen better times. Everyone who knows basic math. She started, frowning at the notes but continued nonetheless. "At least I hope you lot do. Otherwise you should have been sent you home a long time ago." 𝗬𝗲𝗄 sighed deeply, staring at the piece of paper as if by just staring, she could set it on fire. Nothing happened. "It seems that Aizawa has written this one and not Yamada. My apologies for any discomfort." She cleared her throat, ignoring the few giggles, and continued. "From the 24 candidates, 8 are still here. After this challenge, only 5 will be left. The last challenge will eliminate 2 candidates. The final 3 candidates will be fortunate, or in my opinion, unfortunate, enough to meet the prince. He will pick his wife out of these 3 girls. So as you can see, we're nearing the end. You've gotten pretty far. Now, the next challenge will be judged in 4 days, but you can start preparing early. You lot will need it." Izuku knew that Aizawa had intended the words to be harsh, or at least not as motherly as Yamato liked to go. But Izuku barely could contain his laughter. It was a weird combination. 𝗬𝗲𝗄's gentle and sweet voice with Aizawa's sarcasm and general gloomy tone. A queen is expected to be able to entertain people, do something aside from sitting and looking pretty. So in 4 days, you'll be presenting your entertainment skills in front of a group of judges, mostly the usual lot, me, Yamada and Kayama, Shouto, who won't be in any way or form biased, and a few guest judges that you'll meet at judging itself. You aren't allowed to buy anything. That's a lie. These instructions are vague as, okay. Not finishing that. Continuing, yes, you're allowed to buy materials or borrow them, but anything fully bought is considered disqualification. Not that you can really buy entertainment unless you count acrobats. Please don't hire acrobats. You must be able to prove you can be interesting as an individual. Long story short, try to entertain us. Show us that you aren't just a pretty-looking girl. Most of the girls, Izuku included, were smothering their laughter. The message hadn't quite hit home yet, though the back of Izuku's mind was already mulling over the words. Showing off a skill set. Izuku had no skills that would be worthwhile someone's time. He knew that Uraraka could sculpt wood, taught by her parents. Gyro and Nejire had a musical background, so they could come up with something. He wasn't sure about Tsuyu. She might be in a pickle too. From the other girls, he admittedly didn't know all that much. Momo and Kendo were nice, but he hadn't seen them do anything out of the ordinary. No sewing, not creating dresses, cooking, none of the lot. And Telly, well, nobody really knows what she could do. She liked to keep to herself. The girls started to chatter, Gyro asking him what he was going to do. He skillfully talked around this, since Head was completely clueless on what to do. He couldn't drag the judging panel outside and ask them to watch him cut down a tree. That surely wouldn't make for good entertainment and not a good subject. Most ladies hadn't even touched an axe in their lives, especially the ones with a rich background. Maybe he could learn to play the piano in 4 days. It technically should be possible. Well, it seemed that he was finally going home. Izuku felt silly to feel lonely, but he did. Feeling lonely, that is. He still shared breakfast, lunch and dinner with the other contestants, but it was obviously quieter. It was really weird how much a difference 6 people made. It didn't help that most of the people here had their go-to friends and that Izuku felt like an intruder. When it was him, Mina, Hagakure, Tsuyu and Ochako, it didn't feel awkward be among them. But now there were only Tsuyu and Ochako, and there was this weird tension between them. Izuku identified it as we want to date, but we don't quite dare to ask each other out. Not wanting to bother his friends, he found himself in the company of one of the guards. It was a happy accident, really. He had planned to go to the garden but got talking with one of the guards, and suddenly he had no desire to leave. He had met this guard before when he had been looking for Ajiro. It also turned out that this guy was their coachman during their second test. Kaminari Denki was a knight in training, attending the same academy as Kaken. The armor didn't make him stand out that much, only showing off tufts of blonde hair and his piercing yellow eyes. Personality-wise, Kaminari reminded him mostly of Mina. Loud, overly excited and silly. It was a while before anyone else visited the corridor Kaminari was stationed. It hadn't taken Izuku too long to realize that Kaminari clearly had drawn the short straw in the rotation. The corridor wasn't even close to the main part of the castle, where it usually bustled with life. This meant that basically, nobody came here except for Izuku and their new visitor. What are you doing here? Ada Tenya looked a little surprised, his gaze flicking between Izuku and Kaminari. Being bored, Izuku admitted, shutting his sketchbook close. He had dug it up from his bag yesterday, deciding that he had to something to pass his time. You got rid of 6 candidates, leaving only the quiet ones behind. The palace feels empty. She couldn't resist my charm, Kaminari chimed in. Izuku punched his leg, which could hardly be more than a soft tap. To his surprise, Ida sat down opposite of them, back resting against the wall. His sword was placed at his feet, just in reach if it was necessary. It has been quiet, Ida admitted, rubbing his eyes while pushing his glasses up. I've got used to a gaggle of ladies running around, and suddenly they aren't there anymore. Kaminari huffed. Well, you at least got to see them. Midoriya here is the first one that bothers to revisit me. I just wanted some peace and quiet, Izuku admitted, feeling a little guilty. He hadn't intended to seek Kaminari out, it just happened. To his surprise, Ida laughed. That's why you go to Kaminari of all people. I can be quiet. Ida laughed even louder. He looked much younger, much more their age. Being a knight in the royal court must be draining. Hey, don't laugh. Izuku looked up and was surprised that Kaminari's voice and expression didn't match. He was red in the face, but his gaze was soft as if he was endeared by Ida's laughter. Maybe he was. Izuku couldn't blame him. Ida looked a bit like what he imagined a knight in a shining armor would look like. Tall, broad and a serious face. But past that serious facade was a kind heart. A face of another guard poked around the corner, curiosity written all over his face. Izuku recognized him as Kirishima, the red-headed guard that had danced with Izuku during the ball, and the guy Kaken claimed was his love interest. No, partner. The idea that Kaken had a partner was a little weird to him. Holy shit, you made Ida laugh. Kirishima was grinning from ear to ear. How? Kaminari looked proud for a few moments before Ida stopped laughing. Ida got up in seconds, his face stern. Kirishima, return to your post. Ida barked. You can fool around after your shift. Kirishima disappeared faster than he had seen Mina braiding someone's hair. And she was fast, really fast, which was to be expected after having so many hours of practice. It was clear that Ida had a lot of authority here. Please don't distract him too much, Ida told Izuku, picking up his sword and hooking it to his belt. I'm off. Ida left the hallway with a confident stride. Izuku waited a few minutes to make sure that Ida was out of earshot. Well, he might be hiding behind the corner, but that was something Izuku was willing to risk. Is Ida always this uptight? He had no idea if Kaminari knew Ida any better than he did. However, the chance was pretty high since he hardly knew Ida and Kaminari was a knight. Kaminari cocked his head as if genuinely being confused with Izuku's question. He might be. Izuku knew little about the people who lived here. His brother is Ida Tensei. He's the head of the guards. Kaminari paused, shooting Izuku a half-attempted smile. Ida tries to follow his footsteps, but it's hard. Izuku's breath came like a whoosh. Looking at the spot Ida previously sat, indulge them, even laugh, he could only imagine how hard it could be. Head of the guards. It was a hard job, an important, well-paying job. It was something every guard wants to achieve, but at such a young age. Izuku appreciated Ida's determination but also wondered if it was actually doable. So, what's it like, being a contestant? I've always imagined that it would play out like those plays, with a lot of backstabbing, fake deaths and the occasional fights. Izuku giggled. With plenty of time to spare, he started to tell Kaminari about the almost 4 weeks he has been here. It feels like a lifetime ago, but truly, it has been less than a month since he arrived here. It took him a while to finish, long enough for the sun to slowly starting to sink below the horizon, and Kaminari's shift coming to a close. So you like Shouto? Izuku felt his cheeks heat up. Sort of. It's complicated. Not as complicated as dating another boy. It's ridiculous, but girls courting girls is better than 2 guys dating, believe me. You're lucky you like a guy. Despite his best effort, Izuku couldn't put a smile in his voice. He sounded somber at best. Yeah, lucky me. Cheer up, little Miss Gloom. What if I told you a few of the guys will have a card night this evening? Interested? J.I.R.O. had taught him some card games, mostly poker, but his experience was limited. But maybe it was a good thing. No competition, just having fun. J.I.R.O. would have a blast. Having more experienced opponents, and maybe having some different company would be good for them. If I can bring some friends along, sure. Kaminari whooped in excitement. It has been so long that we had girls over. It's going to be so much fun. Kaminari's enthusiasm was contagious. Izuku was actually starting to look forward it. He might not be used to spend a lot of time with guys his ages, but it could be fun. Are we even allowed to? I mean, curfew is a thing. The look in Kaminari's eyes was saying enough. Probably not. But hey, what's wrong with some rule breaking? It wasn't like Izuku would be thrown in prison for the rest of his life if they got caught. At worst, he would be eliminated from the competition. Izuku had been surprised by their male company. He hadn't expected to know any of the guards, so seeing Shiro, Kirishima, and Ojiro there was a pleasant surprise. There were a few others he struggled to remember by name. It didn't help that these guards were seated at another table. They were playing 21, 6 people seated at each table. There were wine and beer and a lot of fattening, finger food. Izuku was crammed at a table that was meant for 4 together with Tsuyu, Momo, Ojiro, Kaminari, and a guy called Shinso. Shinso had a mop of purple curls and looked half asleep, but he was playing well, better than Ojiro who was horrible at 21. Switch. Time to switch, Kirishima shouted, holding up his beer. They have been at it for, what was it, an hour. Izuku felt a little flustered, having accepted the few glasses of wine pushed into his hands and actually drank them. He liked wine better than beer, enjoying the sweet taste. The girls were swept in a whirlwind of movements. Izuku was seated at another table, a rosy-cheeked Ochako and J.I.R.O. joining him. This time, Shiro and Kirishima sat with them, Ojiro being the only familiar player. He had no idea what the skill level of the others was, but with Ojiro, he wouldn't be last. They played a few more rounds, Izuku now declining the wine that was pushed into his hands. By now, it had to be well past curfew. They technically weren't allowed outside their room during curfew. The staff always had turned a blind eye to it, but having slumber parties was something different than spending their time playing cards with a bunch of guys and drinking. They were allowed to spend time with the guys. They weren't exclusive to the prince, but surely this was a bit too much. Nina would have loved this, Ochako said as Kirishima cried in victory after winning another round. I miss her. J.I.R.O. sighed, squeezing Ochako's shoulder in attempted reassurance. We all miss them, but what can we do but enjoy our time here? Also, I stand. Kirishima stopped handing J.I.R.O. cards, now moving on to Shiro who was cramped between J.I.R.O. and Ochako. Imagine the outrage when we tell her about this, Izuku giggled, feeling hot all over. Who is Mina? Shiro asked after throwing down his cards. He probably had a terrible pull. It was Kirishima who answered. one of the ex-contestants, the one with the wild pink curls, the one that was almost always at Toru's side. At the mention of 𝗬𝗲𝗁's first name, both men shot Ojiro a teasing grin. Izuku felt a little bad for the guy, but he mostly found it sweet. He had feared they would be bad-mouthing 𝗬𝗲𝗁, but instead, they were just teasing their friend for having a crush. You absolutely out of her league, 𝗬𝗪 continued. I mean, she's pretty, she's kind, and you're just, well, you. So far for the light-hearted teasing. Was this what hanging out with the boys was like? Jiraiya saved Ojiro's pride by elbowing 𝗬𝗪 in the ribs and shooting a glare at Kirishima. Both guys seemed to cower in fear. He's your friend, she said darkly. Her eyes were thunderous. Shouldn't you be supporting him, instead of making fun of him? Feeling a little courageous, probably the alcohol speaking, Izuku pointed at Kirishima. Neither Ojiro or 𝗬𝗲𝗁 are out of each other's league. That's all bullshit. We all have a different, sometimes questionable taste, and that's fine. That's what being in love is called. Kirishima looked owlishly at him, but any answer was drowned out by applause and the word preach yelled loudly, probably by Kaminari. I mean, this gal actually gets it, Kaminari added loudly. Love is absolutely ridiculous, but love who you want to love as long as both of you are truly happy. There were loud cheers, glasses were raised, and the card games were temporarily put on hold as chatter started to rise. Tales about the throes and woes of love were shared. Izuku realized that everyone was pretty much tipsy, if not flat-out drunk. Everyone was so busy chatting that no one noticed the door opening, nor the newcomer that tried to gain their attraction. There was a loud thump that got everyone on high alert. The knights immediately reached for their swords. I told you guys that there is a curfew. The voice of Tenya spoke. I don't understand how you can see a single thing here. A few torches were lit. There were multiple groans, people squinting at the sudden increase of light. Izuku hadn't realized it actually had been that dark as the candlelight providing enough light to see the cards. Why are the girls here? It was dead silence. Ado let out a long and deep sigh, as if it was an older brother that had walked in on his siblings breaking the rules, but he was too kind to snitch them. Get the girls back to their rooms, safely, and go to bed. This is your only warning. Once Ado left, there was a collective sigh of relief. You heard the man, Kirishima spoke up. Time to tuck in, before we lose our jobs. Where do you lot sleep? The two guards who were still decently sober were Shinso and Kaminari, who explained he was the brains after the whole game night and had to stay pretty sober, so Izuku ended up explaining where he, Ochako, Tsuyu, Jiraiya and Nejire slept. Momo, in turn, explained to Shinso where she and Kendo slept. Intelli had no interest to come, so she was still in her room. Thankfully, she hadn't rat them out as Izuku had feared. Exceeding all expectations, Izuku was lying in a bed 20 minutes later. Nobody had spotted them climbing the stairs and slinking through the corridors. Arriving at their hall, Kaminari had pushed them in Ochako's room. Minutes later, he had fetched a pitcher with fresh water and a few buckets. Ochako's bed was a bit of a tight fit for 5 people. It was a really tight fit, but the moment Izuku's head hit the soft mattress, he was out cold. Shouto was having lunch with Momo, which, he realized, was the first time they were alone since she had gotten here, 4 weeks ago. In the past, when she visited, they would spend a lot of their time together. But due to the nature of the visit, the competition, it had been hard, and Shouto had spent most of his free time with Midoriya. Though he might as well had lunch with a complete stranger as Momo was barely present. She looked tired. Her face looked a little gray as she played with her food. She looked impeccable, as she always did, but there was something off. You're okay? Shouto asked, taking a bite of his own lunch. Momo nodded, her eyes following the food she kept pushing around. Eventually, she just pushed her plate away. Sorry, she muttered. I'm not really hungry. He knew that he hadn't misheard her, but it took Shouto a few seconds to accept the truth. Momo, who wasn't hungry. That rarely happened, especially since he had asked the chefs to make her favorite dish. Are you ill? She sighed. I can't believe Tenya didn't tell you. Though, I get why, knowing you. I'm fine, just hungover. Hungover. Some of the guards invited the girls over for card night. Technically, one of them invited Midoriya, and she invited us along. Nearly all of us went. She stifled a yawn. I didn't realize how much time and wine had passed until Tenya kicked us out. Shouto felt a little betrayed that he had to hear this coming from Momo, and not from Tenya himself. However, he understood why Tenya didn't want to tell him. His father would fire all the men if he heard about this, and he figured that the girls had fun. Was it fun? Momo's face glowed. Her eyes were shining. She came alive in front of him. It was so much fun. You might not have realized it, but it's a bit depressing in here. There are just 8 of us, and that's all we have. No freedom, no fun activities. We have to entertain ourselves, and sometimes it gets hard. And talking to new people is nice, and the guys during card night were nice. A little awkward around girls, but they knew how to make something fun. The question who laid on his lips, but he knew that he shouldn't ask it. The less he knew, the better it was. There were many guards, and Shouto hardly knew all of them. It only would lead to drama, and he wasn't sure if it was worth it. Despite being hungover at lunch, Momo had completely lit up when talking about breaking the rules and playing cards with a bunch of strangers. He should suggest to Izuku that they should hurry the competition along. He knew that the next test was soon, and after, only 5 girls would be competing. And after that, well, he had to make a life-changing decision. The sun was making Izuku's head throb a little. No wine next time, noted, but the cool, fresh air helped. Sadly enough, Ida didn't take pity on him. Your decision was irresponsible, he lectured, slashing at the dummy. You could become the future queen. What if people caught wind of this? Well, now his peace was ruined. What if I don't want to become queen? Izuku countered. Ida stopped hacking at the dummy. His eyes, which were still unnerving, met Izuku's gaze. You don't. He couldn't believe it. Ida seriously thought that he was interested in becoming queen. Of all girls, Intelli was probably the only one who was faintly interested. He knew that Akako and 𝗎𝗪 only liked girls. Tsuyu liked both, but clearly had a budding romance going on with Achako. He didn't know about Kendo, Momo and 𝗎𝗪, but none of them had struck him as obsessed with the idea to become queen. The only one actually interested in Intelli, I think. Izuku ignores the nervous flutter in his stomach. This was a real competition, and surely he could get arrested for lack of trying. The issue is that, aside from the lack of actually having a choice, none of us has actually met the prince. None of us wants to marry a guy we never met. Ida pressed his lips together until it was nothing more than a thin line. Izuku expected to get a scolding, but Tenya sighed, sheathing his sword. I did tell him, Ida said, more to himself than anyone else. But no, keep it all hush-hush, a secret. He's a fucking idiot. Izuku was sure he was getting a stroke. Ida didn't seem to be the type to cuss, yet here he was, cussing out the prince. Tentatively, Izuku asked what was on his mind, ready to bolt if necessary. You know the prince. We grew up together with Momo. I know all his dirty secrets. Clearly, a frustrated Ida liked to babble. That wasn't what Izuku had expected. Ida knew the prince. Momo knew the prince. But wouldn't that mean the prince would favor Momo over anyone else? Maybe that's why he distanced himself from the competition, as he already had chosen Momo as his future wife. She was someone familiar in a sea of strangers. 𝗧𝗪, who was on guard duty, made a gesture that it was almost time for lunch. Izuku was a little relieved. He was curious. Really curious. Unlike Shouto, Ida was actually willing to talk about the prince. Shouto usually dodged the topic. And if he did talk about it, he was really vague and awkward. As he left the garden, he started to wonder where Shouto fitted in the picture. Shouto also grew up together with Ida and Momo, as he was a close friend of the prince. Though, maybe Shouto's status as a commoner made him not as close to the others. Maybe he had been the prince's personal servant turned friend. Izuku would do that, befriending his servant, if he had ever won. I don't have any skills. That's not true, 𝗎𝗪 pointed, offering Achako a winning smile. Just no skills to entertain a crowd. A crowd of royal arses. Izuku piped in, feeling like he could breathe a little easier than he had the last few days. Tomorrow would be the test, and he wasn't ready. But by the sound of it, nobody was truly ready. It made him not feel as bad for being unprepared. It's more about conversational skills, Momo explained, trying to lighten the mood a little. Chit-chat, being polite, laugh at the right time, and tell endearing stories if they ask. Endearing stories, like, Momo pulled a face that probably was supposed to be thoughtful, but looked more annoyed. She probably was remembering one of those chit-chats she had to endure. Outings with friends, where you got the dress, the cute boy you've met. Mundane things that only need a few minutes, but can drag on for hours. 𝗎𝗪 let herself fall on her back, her head falling in Momo's lap. Izuku had the feeling that it was on purpose. For once, I'm happy not to be a rich arse, as Midoriya likes to call it. And you get the chance to marry a person of your choosing, Kendo piped in. She was braiding Momo's hair to pass the time. Arranged marriages are still a thing. There were a couple of joking jabs that they at least would get married. The rest of them had considered a pretty bleak future for themselves. Izuku couldn't imagine ever meeting someone who would want to marry him. Well, someone that wasn't a creep twice his age. There are plenty of people like that, and he preferred not to even think about it. What are your plans for tomorrow? Jump on the podium and sing. Or just talk. We already outruled crying. Izuku could hear 𝗎𝗪's grin. 𝗎𝗪 was the only one who answered. Chat. Talk about the bull. Create a connection. I could throw a show for them, but I don't think they like bar songs. Achako's face lit up in excitement. Looking around, everyone but Kendo and Momo looked truly excited. The two girls did look curious, probably not quite sure what to make of it. You know bar songs? Achako asked in excitement. It was hard to believe, but the night before Izuku surely would be sent home, 𝗎𝗪 was teaching them drinking songs. The most enthusiastic participants were Achako, Momo, and Kendo. None of the three had a really good singing voice, but their enthusiasm made up for. If everything else failed, Izuku might as well try to impress the people with bar songs. Maybe the guards would be impressed. They were a nicer bunch than the rich people Izuku had met during the winter ball. The fun thing about staying at the palace that no morning was the same. While back home, it was a routine. His mom would wake him up. He would get dressed, cleaned, and have breakfast with his mom. Here, it was rare to even be woken up the same way every day. There had been maids pounding on the door. There once have been Shouto. 𝗳𝗏𝗄 once had jumped on his bed. The worst types of wake-up calls had been the water that had been thrown in his face, Mina physically dragging him out of bed, 𝗬𝗪 accidentally shoving him out of bed. The beds weren't fit for 5 people, but they tried and sometimes failed. Being woken up by bells was definitely something new. Scrambling out of bed. It took Izuku a few moments to realize the sun hadn't even started to rise. There was the possibility that the sun would start to rise soon, but realizing how tired he still felt, his guess was on somewhere early in the morning. Maybe 2, as the ringing of the bells didn't stop. It did the opposite and grew more frantic, as if someone was trying their hardest to wake up the entire palace. Maybe that was their goal. Lighting a lantern and slipping in a pair of sandals, Izuku left his room to see for himself what was going on. There was no use staying in his room wondering. The hallway was almost deserted. Only 𝗫𝗫𝗫 had exited her room. She looked only half awake, with her braid messy, her nightgown not even smoothed out, and like Izuku, she had slipped into a pair of slippers. The candle she was carrying casted dark shadows on her exhausted face. Any idea what the bells mean? Izuku asked, yawning as he spoke. 𝗫𝗫𝗫 shook her head, but her face was grim. The rest joined them in a matter of minutes, all bleary-eyed, drowsy, and worried. The ringing hadn't stopped, and now they could hear the shouts in the distance. Izuku knew that they were far away, but the quietness of the early morning made them louder. "I think we should find an emergency room," 𝗫𝗫𝗫 suggested calmly. "Just to be sure. I think this might be an attack." An icy chill run down Izuku's spine. An attack on the palace, with this many guards. He knew that the royal family wasn't popular per se, but the country wasn't suffering. Well, not as bad as it could have been, but attacking the palace was pretty much the same as declaring war on the royal family. It wasn't even subtle. The pounding of feet against the floor came out of nowhere, alarming everyone. Izuku grabbed an unlit torch from the wall, hoping that he could do something with it. 𝗳𝗏𝗄 had decided to bring along a piece of oak wood. Izuku knew that you could actually knock someone unconscious with a solid piece of food, realizing that they were clearly visible for the new arrival. Their lights were a stark contrast against an otherwise dark corridor. Izuku signaled to the rest to blow out their candles. Darkness engulfed them, but Izuku realized his error. The smell of smoke surrounded them. Even if they hid in one of their rooms, the intruder could smell the smoke and realize someone had just been there. Stupid, Izuku scolded himself, steadying his grip on the torch. A large shape came into view. Izuku found it hard to identify them, though he assumed it was a guy. He was about a head taller than Izuku, and at least twice as wide. It was clear that he and his friends didn't have the physical advantage. The man passed a window and was briefly illuminated by the moon. Putting the lantern on the floor, Izuku readied the torch like a club. He imagined that it would hurt to get hit with a wall torch, and there was the element of surprise. The guy's saving grace had been the fact that he passed an exposed window. For a few seconds, he basked in moonlight. Izuku caught a glimpse of armor, a striking white with royal blue. The man had short cropped hair and, wait, were those glasses? Daring to take the risk, unsure what else he could do aside from hoping to overwhelm the attacker, Izuku decided to talk. Well, more like shout at the poor man. 𝗬𝗏𝗍. The man stumbled, coming to a sudden halt. Was that surprise, or did he just give them away? Midoriya, is that you? 𝗬𝗪 started to sob with relief. 𝗳𝗏𝗄 lowered her piece of wood and 𝗧𝗪𝙢 lowered her shoe. Izuku wasn't sure what she was going to do with a slipper, but he supposed that having something to hold on to make her feel safer. Yes, Midoriya. And 𝗳𝗏𝗄, 𝗬𝗪𝗢, 𝗧𝗪𝙢 and 𝗫𝗫𝗫. There was a clunking noise, and suddenly there was light. Like Izuku, 𝗬𝗏 had taken one of the wall torches off the wall, setting it ablaze. He knew that technically they were decorative, but Izuku was happy to have them here. They worked better than candles. 𝗬𝗏 looked battered and bruised. His hair was a mess, his boots unlaced, and his right cheek had started to swell a little. But it was 𝗬𝗏, and Izuku had never been happier to see him. I was told to fetch Uraraka and Midoriya. This part, his gaze flickered over the group of half-asleep girls. What is the rest doing here? The only one who hasn't lost her voice was 𝗫𝗫𝗫, who sounded downright chipper when she answered. We moved rooms the day after the others had left. It had started to get a bit lonely, with just 2 people. 𝗬𝗫𝗫's voice was rough when she chimed in. Or on your own. 𝗬𝗏 took it all in stride. I'm bringing you to a hiding place, which can be locked from the inside and will keep you safe. The attack is small, but we aren't risking anything. So 𝗫𝗫𝗫 had been right. While she hadn't implied an attack, she had sensed the danger and wrongness of the situation. While he was relieved to have 𝗬𝗏 here, With his years of experience and a sword at his side, Izuku couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off, and then it hit him. The closest by hiding place is at least 10 minutes away. He had remembered the layout of the palace and its secrets. His brain had been frantically thinking about an alternative, but there wasn't any. This part of the palace clearly hadn't seen many inhabitants, and if they had, they weren't of importance. Hiding places were specifically made so that the royal family could hide in case there was an attack. The rest of the staff had to hide somewhere else, or pray that the attackers would leave them alone. Turned out, he was talking out loud the whole time. Well, more under his breath, but the quietness made everything louder. Yes, how do you know? 𝗧𝗪 sounded equally impressed as shocked. Clearly, Izuku wasn't supposed to know about the secrets the palace held. Swallowing with little effect, Izuku explained that they had spent a lot of their time wandering around the palace, trying to find its secrets. They once made it into a game. The one who found the most hidden rooms and secret passageways would get bragging rights as the best explorer. And of course, the ball had happened and their need to avoid the masses. Let's go. They followed 𝗧𝗪 in a single file, like ducklings following their mum. There was still the distant noise of battles going on, but nothing had come closer as they climbed stairs. Their feet only soft thuds against the floor. Izuku was glad he was wearing sandals and not heels with their telltale clacking. It was almost too good to be true. They just had climbed a set of stairs, a few corridors away from the safety room, when their luck had ended. Someone was waiting for them. The man looked like he was in his late 20s, with a beard, wild eyes, and worn clothes. The clothes hung loosely from his frame, not quite fitting. He was starved, but not starved enough to not hold them at sword point. Good fortune, the man croaked. A rookie knight and a few of the future queens. The word few made Izuku realize that he hadn't seen all of them. Tsuyu and Nejiru were still standing in the staircase, hidden from sight. Izuku made a go-back gesture as he pressed the unburnt torch against Tsuyu's shoulder. There was a hidden room a floor down, but it was small. It was fit for 2, maybe 3 people. Unfit for all of them, but it was enough for the 2 of them. Tsuyu let out an almost silent sob, which went unheard due to the man's monologue. He felt the torch being pulled from his grip, and Tsuyu's presence disappeared. Seconds passed, and Izuku risked a glance over his shoulder. Both girls had made it back to the landing, almost disappearing into the shadows of the night. Hey, what are you looking at? Izuku jumped, not realizing that the guy actually had been paying attention to them. Swallowing once, twice, and taking a deep breath, Izuku spoke with a trembling voice. So far for looking calm. Nothing, just hoping that. He swallowed back a sob, not even having to pretend. More help will come. More help. I'm alone. Yes, but we have 1 sword, Izuku countered, feeling a little braver. He realized this was how he could tell 𝗧𝗪 that 2 of them had fled, and 3 of us are pretty much useless. There was a reaction among his friends. Subtle, but they all realized what was going on. Before the guy could continue, 𝗧𝗪 decided that it was enough and he charged, catching the man off guard. There was a clash of swords, and all Izuku could do was stare, clenching his fists, and hope that Tsuyu and Nejiru made it safely to the other room. The fight was going well at first. 𝗧𝗪 was clearly the better swordsman here, but his opponent was unpredictable. The dagger had come out of nowhere, the blade sinking in 𝗧𝗪's sword arm. 𝗧𝗪 remained quiet, keeping his sword up with a trembling arm, blood dripping on the floor. 𝗎𝗪 looked like she was about to hurl, face pale, body trembling. Ochako had started to cry, the piece of oak wood landing on the ground with a thud. Izuku felt his hands tremble. He wanted to help 𝗧𝗪, but he didn't know how. He didn't have a sword, and even if he had, his technique was sloppy. He had seen 𝗧𝗪 practice a few times and had taken notes, but notes wouldn't save them. With a clatter, 𝗧𝗪's sword fell on the floor. The rebel kicked it towards them, causing Ochako and 𝗎𝗪 to step back. Instinctively, Izuku picked up the sword, trying to mirror 𝗧𝗪's grip. You want to fight? The man taunted, while his legs were shaking and his heart beating erratically. Izuku's mind had grown blank. He could outwit this guy. He might not have the skills Tenya had, but he had the element of surprise. He looked like a young girl, shorter than the man, and was scared out of his mind. The rebel would assume that he could overpower Izuku easily. Izuku nodded, stepping forwards. 𝗧𝗪 shouted a no and tried to tackle the man, but he sidestepped, and 𝗧𝗪 landed on the ground with a loud thud. Stepping closer, sword in the right position, Izuku waited for the man to strike. He hadn't had to wait long, as the man charged at him. Bracing himself, Izuku managed to keep himself steady as their blades clashed. The man pushed, metal against metal, but Izuku wouldn't budge. Adjusting his stance, it was almost easy to keep the men at bay. The man wasn't really strong, and up close, it turned out that he hadn't that much height on Izuku. He might be fast and unpredictable, but he couldn't pull a knife when both hands were occupied. You surprise me, girlie, the man said between gritted teeth. You have a good stance, but that won't save you. The pressure increased, but Izuku kept steady. His hands were burning, and he wanted to nothing else but dodge and swipe at the man. But that would leave his friend defenseless, and he couldn't allow that. Taking a deep breath, Izuku started to really push back, putting all his muscles in it. The man kept ground for a handful of seconds before the blades were being pushed towards him. To avoid being cut, the man took a step back, and another. Izuku was pushing, overpowering the man. The look on his face told Izuku that he hadn't expected it. As a last resort, the man jumped away, causing Izuku to stumble. Izuku tried to regain his balance before the rebel recovered. While he was still stumbling, Izuku heard a loud thunk, followed by a thud that sounded like a body hitting the floor. Regaining his balance and turning around, he saw the rebel lying on the ground, a piece of oak wood lying next to his head. 𝗧𝗪 was still lying on the ground but moved. Izuku sighed in relief. 𝗧𝗪 wasn't at least dead yet. Dropping the sword, he stumbled over to Ochako and pulled her in a hug. She pulled 𝗎𝗪 along, pressing their bodies together as close as possible. He knew that they should move to the safe room, but Izuku's legs were like jelly. One moment he was fighting, and the other moment it was all over. Ladies, I think it's wise to move her hugging to the safety room. Ada's voice sounded thin, words spoken between gritted teeth. Reluctantly, they let go of each other. 𝗧𝗪 had managed to get up with the help of his good arm, looking a little pale. Being the only one thinking properly, 𝗧𝗪 started to secure the intruder. As Izuku's hands currently were the most stable, Ochako was still shaking, and 𝗎𝗪 wasn't faring much better. He helped 𝗧𝗪 securing the rebel. Once secure, 𝗧𝗪 opened the secret entrance and ushered them into the room. With his mum being their local healer, Izuku helped 𝗧𝗪 with wrapping his arm. Ochako and 𝗎𝗪 put down the bedrolls they had found. This room was overstocked for 4 people, but Izuku liked the comfort of having space to pace around, to have a place to curl up in his bedroll and not having someone breathing down his neck. According to 𝗧𝗪, they had to wait for the bells to ring again, signaling that it was safe. The bells rang again around the afternoon. 𝗧𝗪 was shipped off to the medical wing, where the rest of the injured had ended up. There were no casualties on either side, though many people were still left spooked. Tsuyu and 𝗎𝗪 were completely unharmed, successfully hiding in the smaller safety room. Momo, Kendo, and Intelli too were fine. Their knight, Izuku wasn't familiar with the name, had successfully hidden them in a safety room. Theirs was just a 2-minute walk. Izuku wasn't surprised. He knew that the richer contestants always had a little edge in the competition. Even their sleeping locations was no different. We apologize for today, Kayama offered them, bowing deeply. Aizawa and Yamada were there too. The former had a nasty cut on his cheek. Izuku wondered if he shouldn't go to the medical wing, but from what he knew about Aizawa, the man would straight up refuse being probed by people. One of our priorities has been keeping you girls safe, Kayama continued. But even the increase in manpower didn't deter the people from entering. We don't believe they had the intent to kill, more like interest in kidnapping. Due to the circumstances, we want to be as transparent as possible. We think they were here to kidnap someone and not the prince, but his future bride. I doubt that they would attack again soon, especially with everyone on high alert. However, we wouldn't blame any of you if you want to go home. Nobody uttered a word. Izuku had wondered if he should volunteer to head home. He wasn't going to pass the next test anyway. His rich people-pleasing skills were non-existing, which meant he would have been sent home. This was way less humiliating, as everybody seemed to be spooked by this morning's events. Despite considering it, Izuku didn't raise a hand. None of them did. Kayama sighed. Seems nobody is volunteering. Well, we got a dedicated bunch left. Okay, despite all your resolution to stay, tomorrow, 3 of you will pack your bags and head home. Surprise rippled amongst them. They were continuing the test. After what just happened, were they that desperate to get the competition going? 5 people will stay. 3 of them are picked by us. Kayama gestured to herself, Aizawa and Yamada. And the other 2 are chosen by the king himself and the prince. The prince hung between them like a silent whisper. The prince had picked his favorite. When had he returned? Had he even returned at all? Izuku couldn't help but feel a little bit ill. He didn't want to be the prince's favorite, nor the king's. He actually didn't want to be anyone's favorite because it meant they expected him to possibly win this whole thing. Ochako grabbed his hand, squeezing it tightly. Her other hand was gripping Tsuyu's wrist. Looking around, Izuku saw most girls seeking reassurance with each other. 𝗎𝗪 and Momo had their pinkies linked. Kendo had hooked her arm under Momo and 𝗎𝗪's. 𝗎𝗪 had extended a hand to Intelli, who needed a few seconds to give in and accept it. My vote goes to Lady Hato, Kayama announced. 𝗎𝗪 didn't look all that thrilled, though she didn't start to cry in distress, so that was something. Izuku was quite sure he would start crying the moment they said his name. The king's vote went to Lady Intelli, Kayama continued. Aizawa's vote went to Lady Ieyasu, and Yamada's vote went to Lady Uraraka. On paper, he had a chance of a fourth of being selected by the prince. However, Kendo seemed the more likely option. She was pretty, well-mannered, and an overall pleasant, sometimes intimidating, person. The other options were 𝗎𝗪 or Tsuyu. He would rather see either 𝗎𝗪 or Tsuyu being chosen than himself. He wasn't sure if he could stomach to lose 2 more friends. With the 5 of them, it would get even quieter. Of course, the best option would be Kendo. Izuku could go home, Ochako had 𝗎𝗎𝗎, and it was likely they were the next ones to go home. The prince's vote went to. 𝗬𝗲𝗄 managed to grin a little, despite the circumstances. Lady Midoriya. He couldn't be the prince's choice. In what world would the prince favor him over Momo or Kendo? Well, there could be one reason. Shouto was the one who briefed the prince, which meant that Shouto's positive attitude towards him made him look better. They were friends, Shouto and him. Or at least he liked to think they were friends. Shouto hadn't been spending a lot of time with him, but he had mentioned that he was busy. At first, Izuku had wondered if Shouto was just getting tired of him, but each time he spotted Shouto, he was poring over books in the library, taking notes. To his surprise, Shouto always greeted Izuku. A big chance from Izuku being the one that always greeted Shouto first. Why me? You must have gotten the wrong one. 𝗬𝗲𝗄 started at him over the rim over her glasses, looking surprised by Izuku's complaint. I don't know what the young prince is thinking. I am not him after all. All I know is that he's interested in you. Izuku wanted to cry, though 𝗬𝗲𝗄 didn't seem to notice. She clapped her hands together, putting a confident smile on her lips. That's all, ladies. Lady 𝗎𝗫, Asui and Kendo. Make sure you're ready for departure after lunch tomorrow. Breakfast will be brought to bed around 10, allowing you to catch up on sleep. He was surprised when Ochako immediately pulled him away. Tsuyu followed suit, though she didn't have much choice since Ochako still had an iron grip on her wrist. They entered some abandoned room, and Ochako finally let go. Only then, Izuku realized that almost everyone had followed. Only Intelli had gone somewhere else. Unsurprisingly, Izuku burst out into tears. It was a combination of lack of sleep, the stress, the hunger, and foremost, the fact that the prince basically picked him to become his bride. Why him? If you ever meet him, just kick him in the balls, Ochako said, trying to put some cheer in her voice. That would turn him off. I don't think kicking the crown prince is legal, Tsuyu said thoughtfully. But you can always say no. Izuku doubted he was allowed to say no to the crown prince. He was surprised that Momo was the next one to speak up. The two of them were never really close and still weren't. They had gotten a bit closer over time since there were just 8 of them. But it was still weird to have her crowding his space, wiping away the tears of his cheeks. For a brief moment, he wondered if he had been reading her moony eyes towards 𝗎𝗫𝗄 all wrong. That would be a big plot twist. I'll talk to him, she whispered. Izuku wasn't quite sure what she meant. From what he had heard, Momo and the prince had grown up together, so maybe she could talk some sense into him. But who would replace Izuku's place as the prince's future bride? Momo, Intelli. Thanks, Izuku whispered back, not sure how else to react. It seemed to be the right answer, as Momo retreated to let the rest fuss over a teary-eyed him. He was such a baby, but the idea of having to marry the prince really started to scare him. He wasn't ready to settle down, especially not with a guy who he didn't know at all. Not to mention that there was the whole gender issue. Izuku would be tossed in jail the moment the prince found out that Izuku was a boy. Or he wouldn't care and would force Izuku to dress as a girl for the rest of his life, which might be even worse. Izuku had opted to turn in quite early the same evening. The mood had been really awkward, most of them struggling to find something to talk about. Even 𝗎𝗎𝗎 struggled to keep the conversation going. The disadvantage of going to bed early, however, was that it was way too early when he woke up. He was wide awake at what might be 3 in the morning, and returning back to sleep was something both his mind and body were against. There was just too much to worry about. Tsuyu, 𝗎𝗫𝗎, and Kendo would be leaving within the next 12 hours. And not only that, but the prince had made it quite clear that Izuku was his pick. Unable to entertain himself in bed, especially with Ochako sleeping on the other side, Izuku decided that he should put nighttime exploring on his been there, done that list. Making sure that Ochako was tucked in, he snuck out of his bedroom armed with a candle, a cloak wrapped around his shoulders, and wearing a pair of slippers so that his feet wouldn't freeze from the cold, stone floor. There were no lights in the other rooms from Izuku could see, which wasn't a big surprise. All of them had been tired and restless. That's why Ochako had crashed in his bed, too afraid to sleep on her own but too embarrassed to ask Tsuyu if she could share a bed with her. Well, it seemed that it would be just him tonight. The bright flames cast shadows over the walls as Izuku walked aimlessly around the castle. He did come across a few guards, but they let him be. Most of them looked exhausted, and their number had decreased momentarily, with many of them being stuck in the sick bar. Figuring that having a purpose, even if it was to check up on Ida who he had checked up this afternoon, Izuku headed towards the sick bay. There was nobody but a few knights guarding the door. Recognizing Izuku, they let him pass with the warning he shouldn't disturb the patients. Why they let Izuku pass so easily? He had no idea, but he took it in strides. Leaving his candle behind, Izuku entered the dimly lit medical bay. Despite the hour of the day, there were some whispers here and there. He saw a lady holding the hand of an older knight. Weeping silently, another visitor was dozing in the chair. He and the knight that was bedridden looked almost identical, which made Izuku wonder if they were brothers. There were a few more people like this, family, partners, and friend that were silently guarding their loved ones. He spotted 𝗬𝗪, fast asleep curled up in his bed. The knight had said he would be able to leave in the morning, as his injuries were minimal. Tanjiro, who was placed a few beds ahead, was also fast asleep. He had been stabbed. The wound wasn't fatal, but he would need more time recovering. He saw Bakugo dozing off on the chair next to Kirishima. For once, he looked peaceful. As Ida was a royal knight, his cot was located further down the line, where there were more space and the opportunity for some privacy. The curtains around Ida's bed were partially drawn, blocking the bed out of view, but they weren't saying don't enter either. Stopping in the makeshift opening, he saw that Ida already had a visitor. Kaminari was sitting on the visitor's chair, eyes droopy, hair messy but still awake. He was clutching onto Ida's hand tightly. It was the hand of Ida's injured arm. "Morning," Izuku whispered, hoping that he wouldn't frighten Kaminari too much. Kaminari immediately snatched his hand back, color blooming on his cheeks. He looked at Izuku with wild eyes, as if he expected Izuku to be the bearer of bad news. "It doesn't bother me," Izuku said, taking the other chair and putting it down next to Kaminari. "That you like him. Does he know?" Thankfully, Kaminari eased a little. Not all of the tension was gone, but it was a start. "He does." Izuku admired Kaminari's courage to confessing his feelings so openly. He knew that there were feelings for Shouto, maybe just an ember, kindling but not quite a flame, but it was there. Yet, he hadn't dared to really act on it. Shouto was busy. The contest was almost over, and he had to try his best to be sent home after the next task if there was still a task. He didn't want to marry the prince. "The two of you are together. I assume that it's weird to hold hands with someone that knows about your feelings, but doesn't share them." Kaminari bit his lip, but a smile still peeked through. Despite his weariness, his face had grown more open and alive. "It's just really weird. I will be finishing the academy in a couple of months. This is basically my graduation. If I do well, I will graduate, and if I don't, well, back to the academy. But I had expected to spend my time graduating in my hometown, under the watchful eye of the head of the guards over there." Then the contest was announced and, well, pretty much everyone was offered a position here for their graduation. This place usually accepts a handful of students, sometimes even less. "Wasn't coming here intimidating?" Izuku asked. He was surprised that he didn't even remotely felt jealous of Kaminari. He always had wanted to become a knight, but he never had left home to actively pursue it. And now, he wasn't sure if becoming a knight was really a calling. Maybe it was more about him wanting to show himself that he wasn't lesser than Kaken, that he also could become a knight. "Honestly," Kaminari winked, "I came here with the idea that I might meet a cute girl. There are some cute girls, and there still are some. But for whatever reason, I had to take an interest in this stick-up-his-ass guy who likes rules way too much and takes everything too seriously." Izuku shrugged. "We can't pick who we fall in love with." "Yeah, but I didn't catch the attention of the crown prince of all people." Kaminari waggled his eyes on purpose, making him look absolutely ridiculous. "We were all a little shocked. It must have been centuries since the crown prince has taken a commoner as a wife." Kaminari looked surprisingly hopeful. Izuku hadn't realized what it meant for so many people, having Izuku marrying Prince Todoroki. Certainly, most people had expected the prince to pick someone from a wealthy background, preferably someone who was already close to the royal court. If there had been bets put down on this competition, Izuku had the feeling the majority was expecting Momo to win this whole thing. But he had to disappoint Kaminari. He couldn't marry the prince. Maybe he would fall in love with the prince in the long run, but would he ever be happy? He didn't hate it, acting like a girl, because a lot of it was still him. It was just the dresses and the expectations of other people. But he also missed being himself, rolling out of bed and putting some clothes on, going straight to work, exhaust himself, sitting down and having to listen all day, spending the day looking all pretty. He couldn't do that. He didn't want that. He felt a hand gently patting his knee. "You're okay." Izuku put a grim smile on his lips. He wanted to lie so badly, tell Kaminari he would try his best. But he hadn't it in him to lie. "I don't want to become queen," Izuku admitted. "I never wanted to become queen. I loved being here, meeting all these new people, making friends. But in the end, this is a golden cage. I don't want to be locked up here forever." To his surprise, Kaminari only looked slightly disappointed. "I'm not surprised, really. I think Ieyasu makes a fine queen as well. And honestly, I think the prince is a bit of an idiot. If he likes to think that he knows you, he should know that you can never cage a free spirit and not pay the price for doing so." Wise words. Kaminari grinned sheepishly. "I stole them from Ida. He's good with words. I, not so much. Well, I'm happy to have someone on my side, aside from the girls, of course. But maybe you should get some sleep. It has been a long night." Izuku got up, putting the chair back in place. Kaminari yawned, rubbing his eyes like a little kid. "Sounds like a plan, princess," he grinned cheekily. "I'll escort you back. I would feel terrible sending you out in the darkness on your own. You just don't want to go to bed." The 𝗵𝗃𝗲 look on 𝗵𝗃𝗲's face told him enough. Izuku supposed that he should let 𝗵𝗃𝗲 be. He was an adult, and it wasn't like Izuku knew what he was doing with his life. As they walked back to Izuku's bedroom, he started to think about 𝗵𝗃𝗲 and 𝗧𝗪 being a thing. It felt like a weird combination, but was it truly weird? While he didn't entirely believe in opposites attract, there was potential between the two. 𝗵𝗃𝗲 would help 𝗧𝗪 loosen up a bit, and 𝗧𝗪 could rein in 𝗵𝗃𝗲. And hey, Izuku liked Shouto. Shouto hadn't slept in probably 36 hours. Technically, he had been awake for 36 hours, but he had slept about 2 hours on the morning of the attack. So in the last 55 hours, he had slept too. He was glad Tenya was still stuck in the medical wing. He couldn't scold Shouto for not taking care of himself. He was taking care of himself. Well, his future self. With everything he had gathered by now, he had the answer, his ticket to freedom. Stifling a yawn, Shouto took a large bite out of a sandwich one of the staff members had brought him. Crumbs sprayed all over his notes, but not that there was much to save anyway. His notes looked like they have been put through the shredder. Knowing what he currently knows, he knew that his father could still refuse him his freedom. But that was where the backup plan was for. The chair opposite of his table, belatedly, he realized he should have hidden in his own room, was taken by someone else. A figure in bright blue plopped down on the chair. Shouto immediately knew that it was no one from the staff or guards, as the color was off. Looking up, Shouto almost dropped his sandwich in fright. It wasn't a surprise to see Momo. It was a surprise to see her so angry. Her hair was completely pulled back in a bun instead of her normal ponytail, leaving all of her face exposed. This makes her anger even more prominent. This woman could make grown-up men cry if she wanted. She cried, Momo said, grabbing an untouched sandwich of the platter. Shouto had no idea who Momo was referencing to. Maybe one of the girls that had just left. But that wouldn't explain why Momo was so angry with him. It was the contest, not him. If it was up to him, he could end the contest right now and make a decision. Midoriya cried. Momo added, after 𝗵𝗃𝗲 announced you had picked her to stay. Shouto protested, but there are 4 others, she's the prince's choice. That's basically the same as handing her a wedding ring and telling her you'll be marrying her. I didn't know. Momo's face didn't lighten up at all. She still looked thunderous and ready to commit murder. And not just any murder, Shouto's murder. Listen, I'm not surprised you didn't know. But you have to understand that she likes you, Shouto. But she doesn't know the prince at all. She thinks a complete stranger had just sealed her fate and forced her to marry him. And even if she finds out you're the prince, which will happen soon, she still wouldn't want to marry you. But I'm the same person as the prince. Momo acted a lot like 𝗵𝗃𝗲 at this moment, trying to teach Shouto some social skills he clearly didn't have. She doesn't want to marry a prince, Momo explained. You've told me a great deal about her, but I've gotten to know her a little myself. She isn't made to be someone's side piece. She would be so unhappy here. While not living in riches, while not living her dream of exploring the world, she always had been free. Do you want to take her freedom away? Shouto had never intended to keep Midoriya here. Maybe he should have told Momo about his plans. But that would also mean he would have to tell Momo about what he discovered about Midoriya. Well, he hadn't confirmed it yet, but he linked to cling to that possibility that Midoriya was actually a boy. 5. Plans, Shouto said hesitantly, staring at his notes. Suddenly, his plans started to look a bit foolish. He hadn't taken factor that Midoriya might not want to have anything to do with him, as in not wanting to associate himself with the prince. He had assumed that Midoriya wouldn't care if he was a servant or the crown prince. Clearly, he had been wrong. I just have to refine it a little. Momo didn't look all that impressed. Listen, Midoriya is a sweet girl, but we both know that you'll never see her anything more as a friend. Just keep that in mind. He knew that if Midoriya were a girl, he would never be able to truly love. Nothing beyond friendship. The idea of intercourse made him shudder, but he needed heirs. But if Midoriya was a guy, and Midoriya hadn't faked his interest, there might be a future for them. Not as king and queen, or king and consort, but just as Shouto and Midoriya. He didn't need the crown or throne to be happy in life. He probably was better off without either of them. There was just something off about it. Tsuyu, Gyro and Kendo had left 3 days ago, and he has expected something had happened by now. But nothing related to the contest had happened. Thankfully, their cries of boredom had been heard and a couple of activities had been arranged. They had done some sightseeing, lunching in the big garden, wine tasting. The latter had been slightly questionable, but it had been hilarious to see Momo waste it. However, because they were spending so much time with each other, Izuku started to get a little overwhelmed. To get some breathing space, he had hidden himself in his bedroom, penning down a few letters for Mina, Hagakure, Tsuyu, and even Gyro. While the letters for Mina and Hagakure would be sent tomorrow, the ones for Gyro and Tsuyu would be catching dust in a drawer for a bit longer. There wasn't enough to tell them yet, but Izuku liked to start early. Memory was a fickle thing, and he wanted to pass the time. As he was correcting a mistake in Mina's letter, someone knocked on his bedroom door, startling Izuku. Ink started to spread, creating a big splotch in the middle of the parchment. Seemed he had to start over again. "Come in," Izuku announced, placing the quill far away from the parchment to make sure it couldn't do more harm. Ojiro stuck his head inside. He was still dressed in uniform, but the relaxed posture probably meant that he was off duty. Izuku had a feeling the king wouldn't appreciate his staff to do personal businesses during working hours. The important staff. Izuku had the feeling that the likes of Kaminari and Shiro had a pretty chill job, and could spend their working hours chatting with each other while standing on guard. "The letters for Toru will be sent out tomorrow, right?" Ojiro asked, his fingers holding tightly onto a rolled-up parchment. Izuku nodded. "Can you also send this one?" Ojiro offered him the parchment. "It took me way too long to answer. Her letter, that is." And then a blush stained the guy's cheeks red, and it seemed that Ojiro wasn't willing to continue. "Sure, it won't be a problem." Izuku got up and took the letter from Ojiro. Ojiro wished him goodbye, and Izuku returned to the desk, grabbing a new piece of paper to pen down the same letter again, only this time with the corrections and without ink splotches. "I see Eda is finally cleared for duty," Izuku remarked. Kaminari, who stood next to him, grinned, his eyes twinkling. "Oh yeah, he is. He was going crazy in there. I'm quite sure they kept him there longer than necessary just to tease him." Izuku laughed as he saw Eda barking orders at other knights, telling them what they were doing wrong. As Eda still wasn't allowed to be back on duty, at least guarding duty, he was stuck training some of the teens that wanted to become knights. All of them came from a wealthy background, and to Izuku's and Kaminari's amusement, they had expected to have it easy over here. Eda clearly was having none of it. "That's not how you hold a sword." Eda almost slammed into the poor kid that was fumbling with his sword. "Let me show you." The kid looked really flustered as Eda explained the proper grip. "Do you think he's after your guy?" "Eda's is nobody's guy but his own." Kaminari didn't sound all that bothered with it. "But honestly, 3 years ago I was like that brat. Only my instructor was more than twice my age and crazy scary. This lot is lucky." Izuku wasn't sure about lucky. A few of the guys looked like they were ready to either throw down their sword and throw a tantrum or cry. Maybe even do both. Despite the winter cold, it was really nice weather. It was sunny and good weather for a walk. However, it had been a surprise to see that he was accompanied by Shouto. Izuku knew that Shouto had been busy, but that didn't mean he missed his company any less. Shouto's presence was like a fresh breath of air. He used a certain calmness to him, which might come from growing up among royalty, and he let Izuku chatter to his heart's content, even if it was mindless babble about something that happened over 10 years ago. They had been walking for a solid while before Shouto said anything that was beyond a standard response. "You look tired, are you? I'm surprised you weren't allowed to pick anyone." Izuku blurted, not wanting to hear Shouto worry about him. It was sweet, but Izuku had seen enough pity from the other contestants. The idea that he was the likeliest choice to be the prince's bride didn't sit well with him. Shouto looked startled, before regaining his professionalism. The mask he currently was wearing was one Izuku didn't like at all. "The prince has returned, so I have no further saying in this contest anymore." It felt wrong, hearing Shouto like this. Shouto always had been somewhat stiff, which probably was his appraising. But he always had sounded genuine in his choice and word, not a rehearsed speech like he was currently giving. "You'll always have a saying in this contest," Izuku exclaimed. "You probably played the biggest role in this contest of anyone. You made the final decisions on who to send home. With your choices, you could and still can change the future of this country." Shouto stared at him with wide eyes. Left his lips with a whoosh. He looked almost starstruck. Then, he broke eye contact and opted to stare at the ground, staring at Shouto in surprise. It took Izuku a few seconds to see that Shouto was blushing madly, his entire face resembling a tomato. He looks adorable, Izuku thought. Izuku hated himself for thinking that, because the floating feeling that had been hanging around them just got more noticeable. Izuku didn't quite dare to call it love, but he never had felt connected to someone like he had was with Shouto. Of course, it could be what friendship was supposed to feel like, but he couldn't compare the relationship he had with Shouto to the one he had with Ochako. Thankfully, before Izuku could say something stupid, like admitting that Shouto was adorable, Ida marched towards them. He didn't look stern, but there was a sense of urgency to him. "Shouto," Ida said, before greeting Izuku with a kinder, softer smile. "You're requested to be present at the meeting about the contest." Izuku managed to contain his surprise, though it was definitely there. Shouto had mentioned he had no saying in this contest anymore, yet Ida had been sent to fetch him for a meeting about the contest. Shouto tried for an awkward smile before wishing Izuku a hurried goodbye. Ida didn't join him, instead sticking at Izuku's side. Ida shot Izuku an apologetic look. Bad timing. Running a hand through his hair, Izuku exhaled. He wasn't sure if he was happy about it or not, but he supposed that it wasn't all that bad. "It won't work," Izuku said, feeling like that was the closest thing to the truth. It wouldn't work between them. "How are you so sure?" Izuku looked around, making sure that there was nobody in earshot. There was nobody. You've heard the rumors, I'm the prince's choice. Even if I avoid marriage, which is most likely by rejection, I doubt that Shouto would be allowed to have anything to do with me. This isn't like you and Kaminari. He isn't a contestant. He's free to do what he wants. I am not. Ida stared at him in shock. You know, Izuku nodded and told Ida about the night in the hospital wing, when he caught Kaminari holding Ida's hand. Ida relaxed while Izuku was telling his story. You approve? Why wouldn't I? How many of the girls do you think only like guys? The only relationship I've been aware of was the one between Ojiro and Hagakure. Izuku snorted, covering his mouth to stifle the noise. Under what rock did you live? 24 girls of the same age living in close quarters and seeing each other all the time. Sparks will fly. Ida looked flustered, with his cheeks apple red and posture a little harried. I've been pretty busy, keeping track of all the new recruits and making sure that Shouto actually does the things he's supposed to do. He was a little surprised to hear that Ida was basically Shouto's assistant. But thinking about it, he shouldn't even be surprised. Shouto was messy and forgetful, and Ida seemed to like order and rules. Not to mention that they probably knew each other for a while, seeing as Ida, Momo, and Prince Todoroki are friends. Since Shouto was a close friend of Prince Todoroki, it was likely that both Ida and Momo spent quite some time with Shouto. What's the prince like? Izuku asked. The answer was right in front of him. Ida was probably the only person he would get an unbiased answer. Momo was a contestant, so probably couldn't be unbiased. His family was totally out of question. Ida looked thoughtful, and for a second Izuku wondered if he was going to stroke an imaginary goatee. He didn't. Prince Todoroki is hard to read, at least for a stranger. Being a good friend, I know him better, but he is pretty closed off to strangers. I don't think he's a bad man, but I like him better when he's himself and not the prince, which isn't often. Izuku was surprised by how open Ida spoke about it. He had hoped that Ida was unbiased, but he wasn't actually expecting. Ida was talking about the crown prince. However, after mulling over it for a bit, he figured what Ida was trying to tell. It probably was the palace life. When Shouto's speech had been practices and impersonal, he easily had thought out of that persona, but Izuku assumed that Shouto had to be polite and well-behaved only once in a while. Prince Todoroki had to be the prince nearly the entire time, especially when he was accompanied by anyone that wasn't his family or maybe close friends. Thank you, Ida. Ida nodded, seemed pleased with himself. It's still early, and I'm bored out of mind, Ida admitted, pushing his glasses up, only for them to fall back on the bridge on his nose. And I finished my classes. Would you mind joining me to the city for some sightseeing? Since he originally had planned to spend his entire afternoon with Shouto, Izuku had no other plans. So while he had seen the city a few days ago, it wouldn't hurt to see it again. Sure, why not? Ida offered his good arm and Izuku happily took it. It was weird, as he had expected to do this with Shouto and not Ida. But maybe it was easier, doing this with the likes of Ida, Kaminari, or Ochako, because they would never be anything more than friends. But Shouto could be something more, and that made it scary. Shouto hadn't realized how much he had been isolating himself until his mother invited him over for dinner. Dinner was a quiet affair with just his mother and him. It didn't help that Shouto's mind was occupied with something else. Technically, it was someone else. Was Midoriya Haruka actually Midoriya Izuku? Today, when they were walking in the gardens, he could imagine it. Midoriya's hair was short enough to pass as a guy. His part-time job as a lumberjack also would make more sense. It was physically heavy work. But Midoriya also had mentioned that it was just them and their mother. Shouto still wasn't quite sure how to address Midoriya in his mind. There was a real possibility Midoriya was a guy, but he also could be wrong, and he would feel guilty for referring Midoriya as a him just because Shouto liked to do wishful thinking. Because that was what it was. Wishful thinking. He hoped that Midoriya was a guy because he was selfish. Because he could imagine loving Midoriya if she was a guy. Because on any level but physical, Shouto was attracted to her. The way she loves life itself. The way she loves meeting new people. The love she has for her friends. The silly moments they shared. The excitement in her face when she sees Shouto, her greetings, her goodbyes. The way she could talk for two, but also could sit down and listen. She was the total opposite of the girls he had met before, where the words were calculated, where the most important person in the room was themselves, where the idea of going outside and get dirty repulsed them. There were more girls like Midoriya, but they weren't the one Shouto was introduced to. Something is on your mind? His mother asked. He glanced at his mother's plate and saw that she had finished at least half of it. Shouto's food was pretty much left untouched. Just the contest, Shouto said dismissively, feeling a twinge of guilt for brushing off his mother like that. He just didn't want to talk about it. The contest itself, or are we talking about a specific lady? There was amusement in his mother's voice, which he wasn't used to. Her eyes were even bright with amusement, which was definitely a first. Just the contest, Shouto repeated, but he knew he was fighting a losing game. Lady Midoriya, his mother confirmed. It was a little scary that his mother knew him so well, or that his regard towards Midoriya was so obvious. He didn't try to make it too obvious, but clearly he had failed. It's complicated, Shouto admitted, pushing around his food. I don't know what to do. His mother wasn't smiling, but she did try to look encouraging. I think you will figure it out. I know you will. I have noticed you have been reading up on our family history. Shouto took a sharp breath, worried about what else his mother was going to say. Was she going to forbid him from continuing his research? Was she going to tell his father? So many things could go wrong, and he was worried that now he was so close, everything would come crashing down. Don't worry, your father thinks you're just looking up our family tradition in preparation of your marriage. I don't think you're. But whatever you're doing, make sure that you're happy. A lump formed in his throat. Would he manage to give himself a happy ending? And at what cost? He probably was going to be selfish, and he was afraid he would hurt his family in the process. I don't think Lady Midoriya is a bad choice. She just isn't fit for this. His mother gestured to the grand dining room they were dining. 50 people easily could have their dinner here, but at best, they share the table with 5 people. It used to be 6, but nobody dared to bring up Shouto's third sibling. He wasn't even sure if his oldest brother was still alive, and he had learnt not to think too much about it. It wouldn't get him anywhere. I'm not all that hungry, Shouto said, pushing his untouched plate away. I think I will return to the library. His mother looked disappointed but not surprised. Don't forget to eat. Will you? I will try. Shouto left the dining room at a steady pace, not too fast that it looked like he was running away from his problems, but fast enough that he made some actual progress. He wished that it all could be smaller. All this grandness gave him a false sense of freedom. Offering the night-standing guard outside the dining room a small nod, he headed towards to the library. His mother approved of Midoriya, but would she do the same if Midoriya actually turned out to be a guy? Wouldn't it be more likely that she would disown him, or demand him to marry someone else? Anyone that was actually a woman? Shouto, are you okay? He hadn't realized that Tenya was, wherever he currently was. Looking around, he realized he wasn't even on his way to the library. He was most likely heading towards the gardens, where only just this morning he and Midoriya were. Walking, talking, joking around. He could remember the spark in Midoriya's eyes when she told him he had his own voice. Despite being the crown prince, he never had a voice. His father always made all the decisions. And if he protested, his father would just glare at him, and that was that. I think, Shouto said, his voice trembling, that no matter what I do, I won't be the one with the happy ending in this story. Tenya looked at him with pitiful eyes. I think you should have a little more faith in yourself. He wanted to believe Tenya so badly, but he feared that something had to give. His happiness, Midoriya's happiness, his family's happiness, one of those will give at the end. And Shouto wasn't sure which one he would let go. Is any of us actually qualified for this? Momo, we're building a blanket fort. But what if it collapses? We could die. Ochako laughed loudly, helping 𝗎𝗓𝗎 with pinning down the roof while Momo was sewing 2 blankets together. She had been the one to protest the loudest when they had started their project. But aside from the occasional "is this safe?", Momo seemed to enjoy herself. She had this glint in her eye that Izuku had started to associate to fun. Considering her background, this might be first blanket fort Momo has ever made. We're not planning on letting this thing cave in, Izuku assured, helping Ochako to secure a sheet underneath a heavy piece of wood. As long as we aren't leaning on the roof. Yeah, the roof is off limits, Ochako agreed. If we just could use rope, we could tie it to the bedposts, creating a big canopy instead of this. Ochako gestured to their not quite stable-looking blanket fort. A couple of corners were pinned down by wooden logs, and one corner of another blanket was pinched between the wardrobe doors. It was unconventional, to say the least. That's what I am doing, Momo announced, tying off the end of her thread and showing them the result. The 2 sheets tied together was enough to create a canopy. Only if they would be able to tie them to the best post. I don't think I've rope, but maybe an alternative. Give me a. 𝗎𝗎𝗎 shot them 2 thumbs up before carefully opening the door, making sure that their wonky canopy wouldn't collapse as one part was tied to the doorknob. They waited in silence for 𝗎𝗎𝗎 to return. After a minute, the girl showed up with a heap of, wait, was that a ribbon? Izuku never had seen so much ribbon in one place. Why do you have so much ribbon? Ochako asked as 𝗎𝗎𝗎 started to untangle the bunch in her arms. My mother packed it, 𝗎𝗎𝗎 said, for my hair, but I never used it. There were several shorter ribbons which were perfect replacements for rope. With the help of Momo's sewing skills, they hung up the 2-sheet broad blanket on the high end of Ochako's bedpost. Because the blanket was way too big, but the holes strategically cut, the blanket fell like a white wall. While it didn't completely close of the bed, it did create a sense of coziness. Not bad for someone who never built a blanket fort, 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧 commented, taking a step back to check out 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧's completely decked out bed. The bed was heaped with pillows and blankets. A few lanterns stood in the alcove above 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧's bed, casting a warm glow on the white fabric. Momo glowed with happiness. 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧 rubbed her hands together in excitement. Now we just have to test it. Momo and 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧 had fallen asleep a while ago. However, Izuku couldn't help but stare at the makeshift ceiling. He didn't know if 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧 was still awake or not, and he was too afraid to ask, afraid he would wake her up. Deku, 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧 whispers. For a brief moment, he wondered if it has been imagination, but he wasn't tired enough to start hearing things. Yes, 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧 sighed in relief, but neither 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧 or Momo stirred. Can't sleep at all, she admitted, turning so she was facing Izuku. Her face was dimly lit in the candle light. She looked tired, her eyes heavy. Me neither, Izuku grimaced, mentally kicking himself in his incapability to properly think. Nervous, I just miss home, 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧 admits. We've been here for over a month, and for a long time, it was fun. But it was hard when Mina and Toru left, but now with Tsuyu gone, and Gyro too, it no longer feels like a home, Izuku suggested. 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧 nodded. Her face brightened a little. But at least I'm not suffering from heartache. It's not heartache, Izuku quietly protested. I'm quite sure that I am not in love with Shouto. I think there could be something, but not in these circumstances. What I currently feel is probably just friendship. I think it's growing love. 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧 tried. There could be more if you both want to. Izuku wanted to scream. What use was growing love? He liked Shouto, but those feelings would never be returned. Not that it mattered much, as Izuku was most likely stuck either marrying the prince or talk himself out of the competition and leave everything behind. Unless he would confess his growing feelings for Shouto soon, he wouldn't even have a chance to speak with Shouto about them. Though, leaving would be easier knowing that he doesn't have to stick around for Shouto. On the other hand, if he wouldn't marry the prince, who else would? He didn't wish that on anyone, even Intelli. 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧 had her things with Tsuyu, no matter how fragile and barely there it was. While he wasn't sure, he knew that there was something going on between Momo and Gyro. And even if there was nothing, Momo didn't look like she wanted to be tied down. She had grown up pretty isolated. This must be her first adventure. And 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧, who went instead of her sister. She had never attempted to win this thing. Her more mature personality, cute appearance, and excitement had gotten her this far. 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧 reached out and took Izuku's hand in hers, squeezing gently. Hey, don't feel pressured. Maybe there is only one Shouto out there, but there are more guys and girls out there. If Shouto doesn't like you, it means that he isn't the one for you. While the words weren't reassuring, Izuku appreciated them. First love. It was hardly even love. This was his first time having romantic feelings for someone. What were the odds that those feelings were returned? Logically, that percentage was pretty low, especially looking at the odd circumstances they were in. If Izuku and Shouto had met like normal people met, like living in the same village or spending time in the same library, those were normal places to meet. Not during a contest, in which the crown prince would pick his future wife, in which one person was the prince's favorite, and the other person the prince's best friend. What if I wish he was the one for me? That's what everyone wish, 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧 said, lacing their fingers together. That your first love is your soulmate, the person that makes your life even better, someone you want to spend eternity with. Izuku squeezed her hand, appreciating the comfort. There was something oddly familiar about this. Izuku settled on the fact that it felt like family. What was going on between him and 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧? Maybe like a sister, though he always had assumed that siblings would drive each other up the wall. Supporting each other seemed like a weird thing to do, as siblings. Or maybe he just didn't know. If we're both painstakingly single when we hit 25, we could hit the road as friends, Izuku suggested. You're proposing to get eloped to rid ourselves of all advances. I'm proposing to travel together and see the world together as friends. Traveling alone isn't fun. And if there is nobody who wants to stuck with us, we might have to be each other's company. 𝗬𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧 let out a muffled laugh. Even in the dim candle light, Izuku saw her eyes dancing with mirth. You've got yourself a deal, but if I find a wife, you're third wheeling. That's a deal. Is it weird to make a deal with your best friend about the future? Izuku asked Kaminari, leaning next to him. Kaminari was on duty, so technically Izuku shouldn't bother him. But with Kirishima calling in sick and with his replacement having a stick up his arse attitude, Kaminari had been bored out of his mind. Since he had nothing else to do, with Shouto last minute canceling on him, Izuku had decided to spend his free time chatting with Kaminari. Not really. Kaminari shot him a curious look. I mean, me and Handa, that's zero for you, made a deal that we would buy our first house together. But you're together with, you know. Izuku copied Ida's movement when he was shouting, which were odd, sharp arm movement. Kaminari laughed. Good impression, he said, his eyes twinkling. That might complicate things, but I won't drop Handa like that. I think the three of us will just move in together, which would be cheaper. So maybe it isn't all that bad. What did you promise your best friend? Traveling the world together when we're 25 and still without a partner. This time, 𝗵𝗃𝗧 didn't laugh. Instead, he looked at Izuku with surprise written all over his face. Is it that weird? 𝗵𝗃𝗧 flushed. No, I don't think it's weird, at least the traveling part. But you being without a partner. I imagined you being married by then. Now it was Izuku's turn to be surprised. Married? Yes, don't you and Shouto have this thing going on between the two of you? Did it really look like that? He was used to the teasing from the other girls, but he always had assumed it was more wish fulfillment than anything else. It would make for a romantic story. A contestant finding love during the contest. But it wasn't the prince. But he would leave that to 𝗧𝗪𝗏. I don't think it would work out, Izuku said. 𝗵𝗃𝗧 was kind enough to change the subject, chatting about last night's game night and how 𝗎𝗪𝗎 failed spectacularly at winning anything. They were rudely interrupted by someone's presence. Izuku could hear the echo of the footsteps even before he could see the person. For the first few seconds, Izuku had expected it to be 𝗧𝗪𝗏, but he was surprised to see Shouto turn the corner. He looked like he actually knew where he was going, which meant Shouto had a reason to be here. Midoriya, I'm sorry for canceling on you. Shouto smiled apologetically. There is something I would like to discuss, if you have time. He wasn't sure what to feel. He wanted to be defiant and say no, but he also wants to spend time with Shouto. Shouto looked genuine in his desire to speak with Izuku, his expression open and almost vulnerable. It must be something important. Sure, Izuku nodded. See you later, 𝗵𝗃𝗧. 𝗵𝗃𝗧 waved him a silent goodbye as he followed Shouto to wherever he felt safe to talk.